I would like to invite Professor Stuart Michael McManus, Associate Director, Center for Comparative and Public History, Department of History, CUHK, to deliver an opening remark. Professor McManus, please.
Colleagues, guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Bringing Together China and the West, 融汇中国与西方, a symposium to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. As you've heard, today's symposium and the exhibition it accompanies coincides with the 60th anniversary of CUHK's founding in 1963 and showcases the library's growing collection of early modern books about Ming and Qing China. These are brought together under a theme that reflects the university's abiding mission, quote, to combine tradition and modernity and to bring together China and the West. With this in mind, today's symposium brings together scholars from Asia, Europe, and North America to explore the history of China-Western relations from multiple perspectives, including religious exchange, visual culture, literary influence, medicine, historiography, and classical studies. To do so, each of our speakers will introduce their topic with reference to one or more books in the exhibition. These include some of the finest examples of early Western, mostly Jesuit sinology. To take a few examples, we have a talk on Boehm's famous translation of a series of Chinese treatises on Chinese medicine. This includes diagrams, which you might have seen in the exhibition, that reveal the extent, but also the limits of Jesuit translation. We also have papers that address both the Chinese and European language works of Adam Scholl, after whom Adam Scholl residence at CUHK's United College is named, including his Huogong Jie Yao, or Essentials of Gunnery, a wide-ranging and influential work on military technology that was written in the context of the Ming-Qing transition. The violent years of the 17th century also formed the backdrop for Martini's widely read Bellum Tartaricum, several versions of which the CUHK library holds, and which will be making an appearance in the second panel. The long shadow of the Qing conquest will also be the subject of the presentation of our most precocious speaker, Ross Moncrief, examination fellow at All Souls College, who will be regaling us with tales of Manchu-Chinese relations through the eyes of the McCartney Embassy. But it's not all cannon and marauding Manchus. We also have presentations on the meeting of book cultures and humanistic traditions, perhaps best exemplified by the monumental Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, which has pride of place in the arts and humanities section of the exhibition, and which will be mentioned in passing in several presentations. Indeed, either between the panels and after the symposium, I hope you will all get a chance to see the exhibition, which will be open until August 2023. For those of you outside of Hong Kong, I'll also mention that there's an online version of large parts of the exhibition available through the library website. Anyway, that's enough from me. Please enjoy the symposium, which I'm sure will paint a vivid portrait of this early period of Chinese-Western relations, and thereby, I hope, give us an opportunity to consider how we might better bring together China and the West. Thank you and enjoy the symposium.
Thank you, Professor McManus. Please stay. May we now invite the speakers, Professor Wang, Professor Wai, moderators, Professor Pook, Professor Martin, and Ms. Lee to come forward to take a group photo together. Thank you all. Please be seated. The first panel of the symposium, Art and Culture Between China and the West, will have 4 presentations, and Professor Po Wen-Kin, Department of History, will be the moderator. Please now give a warm welcome to Professor Pook.
Good morning, afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So my great pleasure and honor to be the moderator of the first panel. So today we'll have four speakers, four scholars, and two of them will be joining us online. So the first speaker will be Professor Wang Lianming, and the topic is the return of the elephant, caught imaginations in early modern Sino-European encounters. So may I? So let's welcome Professor Wang.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Professor McManus. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to this symposium. And given the time limit, in today's talk, I'm going to explore three interrelated issues occurred in the early modern Sino-European encounters. I will primarily explore the way how Asian elephants, which traveled globally, were deployed for conceptualizing China's imperial spaces and shape their visual representation. Secondly, how the representation of imperial spaces imagined as a site for elite self-identification with cross-cultural objects. Last but not least, I will quickly reflect upon the nature of chivasserie, particularly through a cross-cultural comparison between François Boucher and his Chinese counterparts, arguing that European representation of China's imperial spaces started early modern visual and decorative arts went far beyond a pure desire of luxury others. Instead, they were major sites for cross-cultural encounters, entanglements, and self-projection, an aspect that have been largely ignored by the current scholarship and interpretive framework of Xinjiang. I hope that you don't mind I'm talking without mask because I kind of something. In 1760, a large wall fixed hangings, known as 10,000 countries paying tribute, depicting splendid ceremonial moments of foreign ambassadors paying tribute at the Qing court, was commissioned by the Qing Emperor. Given its content of its inscription, and particularly because of the painting's specific location inside the hole of mental cultivation, it is safe to suggest this painting represents a former audience of the Qing. Most likely, as a recent study revealed, illustration of ambassadors were taken from early Chinese paintings and reference books, and additionally from Emperor's ethnographic companion known as Illustration of Primitive People, Zhigongzhu. Despite the fictional dimension of this event, the view is comprised of architectural components of actual inner palatial space as a stage for upcoming audience. While the emperor is waiting behind the gate of supreme harmony and thus remain invisible, crowns of foreign ambassadors bearing lavish gifts were kept outside the palace gate. Among the crowd, two elephants adorned with imperial jewelry and tassels leading the procession are the most prominent features in the program. And highlight that can by no means be ignored is a keen interest in the delicacy and sensuality of the objects that turn this painting into a kind of inventory of the Qing material plenitude. Some of the gifts, for example, on the right-hand side, the accentuation steeds reflect the contemporary Qing possession of cross-border goods from Tungaria and Western Mongolia. Many of other objects, however, including elephants' imperial jewelries, the shining turquoise corsonnet vase, lower left, the pearls and gemstones gilded from on the elephant's back were taken from the 16th century Chinese court painting and contemporary woodblock prints with a reference to China's maritime past. Although the painting is believed to represent New Year audience, the presence of elephants outside the gate to print harmony is unusual. According to the collective study of the Qing, which regulates the movement of the people and animals during the ritual, 5 elephants adorned with gilded vessels were positioned outside the outer palace gate, known as Meridian Gate. So it's not the gate of supreme harmony, but instead the Meridian Gate woman. Given the strict regulations, the appearance of the elephant in the Qing New Year hanging transcends the boundary between the outer and inner palatial spaces, turning the Qing palaces into a imaginative site for showcasing ample material plenitude from both contemporary Qing and the China of the past. In the 17th century, European travelers and Jesuit reports, elephants were reported as a central component of the Qing palaces, and they were exclusively deployed for defining and modifying the court space and leading the procession as a means of balancing the moving forces of the city, or in the words of Jonathan Hay, the scansion of imperial city. They not only staged the piece in the borderlands, for example, Yunnan and Laos and Thailand, but also highlight the far south edge of the empire. On a smaller scale, the spatial placement within the imperial palaces reflected the position within the geography of the empire, or in other words, as they were as a spatial indicator that denote the imperial south and thus define the boundary of the palatial area, which was conceived as a miniature of the empire. But unlike what we learned from Qianlu's New Year's hanging, the Qing former audience imposed a different positioning of elephants in court space. And according to it, now on the left-hand side, it's from Qing, the right-hand side from the Ming, and you can see the Qing deployed less elephants than in the Ming dynasty. So in the Qing dynasty, 7 elephants were positioned outside the Meridian Gate, and they were not allowed to enter in the palace areas. And this hierarchical differentiate disposition of elephants in space shaped both Chinese and European perception of Qing imperial spaces. In the 17th century Chinese representation in an imperial court, elephants' space defining function was well known. Although the Jesuit father Matteo Ricci was never received in a formal audience by the Ming court, he stated that, quote, at each of 5 doors, there are elephants also placed by ways of protection and the court, stressing the elephant's role in defining the court space. A similar eyewitness account made by Alvaro Smedo, who specified a number of elephants which guarded the palace gate at 5, which corresponds to the number of 5 elephants carrying the gilded vases stationed outside Meridian Gate, Wumen, as stipulated by the Qing ritual manual. From Johann Neuhoff, who joined the East Indian Company's mission to Beijing between 1655 and 57, we learned that they encountered 3 black elephants with gilded towers at the court gate. Sounds weird. Although the elephants were absent in Neuhoff's original drawing, which is now the one on the right-hand side, surprisingly, generic image of the 3 elephants were added to the published version in 1665, the one on the left-hand side. Given the gilded towers on elephant back mentioned by him, it's reasonable to suggest that the embassy of East Indian Company was welcomed by a formal audience in front of Meridian Gate, Wumen, joined with elephants. So they were never inside, behind the gate of Supreme Company. In addition to the palatial structure and engraving detailing the inner palatial space of the whole of Supreme Harmony were the former audience which Shunzhi Emperor took place. Was added to the published version of Neuhoff's influential travel note and became a major source for numerous European representation of the Chinese imperial court. In Simon de Ferry's fanciful version of Asia, now on the left-hand side, the engraver Romain de Hore placed the courtyard of the whole Supreme Harmony before a fictitious orientalized landscape with remarkable towering structure. In this amalgamated view, most significantly, Neuhoff's eyewitness of the inner palace was staged, which staged an actual critical event, has been transformed into a virtual stage for displaying the ethnography of the Indies. In contrast to the grouping of the Indies placed in the foreground, as you can see, there are Chinese, Japanese, Manchu cavalier soldiers, Thai, Javanese, and Malay, showing a variety of costumes, headdresses, and ways of salutation. 3 elephants were captured in profile near the entrance of the whole Supreme Harmony. Again, you can see on mouse here. Instead of forming a guards, they were placed together with a caravan of camels commonly seen in the Dutch accounts and Mughal courts, particularly from Olaf Dappe's book on Great Mughal Empire, published in 1672, now on the right-hand side. Having consulted multiple sources, the Hui's engraving, the one on the left-hand side, highlights a watershed moment in the European imagination of the Qing palaces. as it captured the moment when the political place would transform into a stage for displaying and the ethnography of the Indies, which has been blended with the 17th century Dutch view on Mughal court. Just 3 years later, after the Vries publication, Bouvet started to design a series of tapestry dedicated to the life of Chinese emperor. It's believed that the design was finished by 1690, but some of the tapestry were woven and were in production until 1730. The audience scene of the Chinese emperor, now the right-hand side from Bouvet, was undoubtedly inspired by the Horvath engraving, now the left-hand side. Under gigantic baldachin supported by slender spiral columns, the emperor sits on the throne, surrounded by his servants and kowtowing officials. An elephant led by a Manchu soldier is positioned behind the emperor's throne, implying their intimate spatial relation. The Bouvet tapestry further linked two pieces of work together. In the Dutch version of renowned Jesuit father Louis de Comès' Nova Mémoire sur l'état présent de la Chine, the one on the right-hand side, which was believed to be the most faithful account on China besides Neuhof. An amalgamated view of the Qing imperial court was produced by consulting both the Horus engraving and the Bouvet tapestry. What's interesting is that the audience scene in this view followed the open-air setting of the Bouvet tapestry. It placed the throne in front of a multi-storied palace building with two elephants taken from the Vries novel. Contemporary with Le Comte, when Yves Brandt traveled to Beijing as a Russian envoy in 1692, he delivered a detailed account on the imperial stable where 14 elephants from Siam, so Thailand, were kept. Although he did not specifically comment upon the audience ceremony, an engraving with a view of a reading gate, which was modeled after Doctor's book, now the right-hand side, published in 1670, supplemented the published edition of the Travelogue. In this view, in which 4 elephants and an elephant-breathing chariot, which is this one, are joining the imperial parade, the imperial palaces have been interpreted as a site for showcasing a virtual, high-profile ceremony that a Russian embassy received. In this view, the pavilion-like throne, which this one with 4 sides, closed window and chariot, which are reminiscent of a towering structure in the background, suggesting that the engraver might have responded to a written account, something like Neuhof's description of the elephant with gilded towers on their backs. Same as the case of De Vries, the abundance of Indian elephants scattered in the 17th century Dutch accounts at everywhere you can find, seems to have provided major sources for fulfilling this kind of image. By the turn of the 17th century, a variety of published Dutch sources of Mughal court became available and widely circulated, primarily Doctor's book, and including the one on the right-hand side, Oost-Indianische Reis. Both works offered elaborate views of Indian elephant throne, draperies, and mahals. These shared features with the Mughal court also persisted into the 18th century Chinese scene of visual art in the French Rococo. In addition to the first release set, a small preliminary painting prepared by François Roger for a tapestry set series called Fondue Chinois were published were made in 1742. The view, La Foire Chinoise, which is this one, the Chinese fair, was normally to be understood as presenting a fanciful view into anonymous Chinese urban space with pictorial assemblage of elements that Boucher copied from different various published sources. Recently, a crystal semantics study suggests Boucher's Chinese fair, which incorporates a both fusion of figures with different professions, might have responded to a Jesuit description sent from Beijing, detailing the shopping street in the garden at Yuanmingyuan. Semantics identification that the scene might imply the courtly view is further reinforced by the presence of 2 elephants placed in front of the gate towers and pagoda that we normally encounter in 17th century Dutch prints. White elephant on the right-hand side with a turbaned man carries a golden throne to its left. A rolling elephant, this one, with a remarkable raised trunk catches the viewer's attention. On its back, Boucher added a sketch form of a pavilion-shaped throne covered with golden draperies. This unusual iconic pose recalls the elephant called Hanno, which made its trip from India to the 16th century Rome as a gift of Portuguese King Manuel I to the newly erected Pope Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, known as Leo X. Through Giuliano Romano's drawing, just at the right, which were believed to have been made from life, Hanno went far beyond a famous papal pet to become a global icon, participating in the 16th century European imageries of Roman antiquity and the Christian-Muslim confrontation. Known as a tribute to the Pope that conjured a triumphal sentiment of Portuguese conquest of the East, Hanno appeared in the 16th century conflicts, filled the role of his African cousin, who joined the Roman circus and Asian battle against the Carthaginians, and finally made his own way to Tokugawa, Japan via a non-violent screen depicting the Battle of Lepanto between the Christians and Ottomans. Although it's less likely that Boucher adopted Romano's drawing as a mediator model, the early modern European experience and imagination of the heretical Orient was closely associated with elephants in Mughal India. More convincingly, in terms of a concrete model, Boucher specifically looked at the Hui's engraving of the Mughal court, this one, which they are almost identical, right? And in this field, in which the Mughal court is imagined as a bustling world full of gigantic battle-hymn, tents, and professional processional events, elephants were used as a placeholder, pictorial placeholder, and joined the Mughal court, and then later reborn as imperial perchdoms in Boucher's Chinese fair. Given the elephant's role in defining and modifying the Qing imperial palaces, Boucher's view might have implied an imperial place or even a semantic suspect, Yuanmingran, we don't know. Through a detailed comparison, I will suggest that the way the Boucher's elephant were positioned in relation to the towering structure, city gates, and orchards recapitulates the Hui's ethnographic interpretation of the Qing palace. Through the process of this visual translation, an inside-outside movement in terms of spatial representation was achieved. The Qing inner palace is the area behind the Gate of Supreme Harmony, where courtiers and ambassadors who normally parade for formal audience have been transformed into a public stage set up for the Chinese fair. Boucher's view was a milestone in the late 18th century French chinoiserie and influenced many it, including Jean-Baptiste Piemonte's elephant procession. In 1760, when the Qing conquest of Inner Asia was achieved, the making and the public hanging of 10,000 countries paying tribute and its different versions facilitated the celebration of this very moment. Exhibiting an array of cross-border objects, including Central Asian steeds, European mechanical clocks, the historical goods like a textile obtained from China's American past, this type of hanging celebrates the Qing palaces as a site for displaying the empire's expanding border, territory, and its universality, and furthermore, for the Manchu self-identification with the cosmopolitan material cultures that parallel the rapid geographical shifts. Same as the Boucher's palace gate that separates the palace area with urban space. In this series of hangings, the Gate of Supreme Harmony not only highlights the boundary between the inner and outer palace areas, but the juxtaposition of the invisible central and highlighted periphery, the imperial dominance as performed in upcoming ritual and obeisance of the tributary bears, as seen in the wealth of cross-border objects to which the elephant belongs. In 1743, Boucher's painting, including Chinese fair, were woven into tapestries by the Bouvet manufacturers. Conceptually, the Chinese fair, which delivers a vision of Asian material plenitude, including textile, lacquer cabinet, fans, but also the Eastern carpets and silver vessels, blue-white porcelain in European metal mounts, is something very similar as we will encounter in the Qing hanging of 10,000 countries paying tribute. It must be emphasized that Boucher's Chinese fair went far beyond a European ethnographic representation or a fanciful version of luxury art. Instead, as I will argue, It transformed the representation of political place made known through the Sino-European diplomatic interactions, travelogues, and published prints into a imaginative site. By the French minister Henri Bertin as an informal gift to Emperor Qianlong, with the hope of establishing a relationship with China. We do not know whether Qianlong made any comment upon this representational matter of this tapestry. Nevertheless, a European-style palace called Immense Ocean Observatory, Yuan Yingguan, was especially built to house this gift. In this new site, the hanging and displaying of this tapestry set and other European items not only remind us what we have encountered in the hangings of 10,000 countries paying tribute, in which the imperial palaces became a site for cross-cultural encounters and imperial self-projection, but also at the same time highlights an equal to Boucher's Chinese fair, now staged in a real European palatial space that we might refer to an occidentally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Thank you for your very interesting and fascinating talk. Right. So, Professor Wang is Associate Professor in the Department of Chinese and History, City University of Hong Kong. And our next speaker is Professor Wei Lingjia. She's from our university, Department of Translation. Professor Wei, thank you. Sorry, and her topic is overlapping of the Western and Chinese bodies. Accommodation involves Latin translation.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophie Lingjia Wei, and my topic today is overlapping the Western and Chinese bodies, accommodation in Boyum's Latin translation. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor McManus and CUHK Library for the invitation. It is truly my greatest honor to join you to celebrate the 60th anniversary of CUHK and also join this symposium. Next, you can see these are two photos from the archive tour I had for my class, History of Translation. And due to the archive and rare manuscripts, especially for my class, History of Translation, my students could also do the first-hand research. One of the manuscript is the one I'm going to talk about today, Boyum's translation. So today in my talk, I would like to especially re-examine the two medical systems, Chinese medicine and Western anatomy, by exploring two cases. One of the two cases is Boyum's translation, Specimen Medicinae Sinacae, a look at the medicine of China, and Clavis Medica, key to the medical doctrine of a Chinese on the impulse. And the other one for the comparison is the manuscript stored in Bibliothèque Nationale de France, BNF. This article has been published by the Journal of Translation Studies, and I would like to share my research with you all today. I would like to start from the introduction. Translation is a cultural activity that produces new spaces or creates new imaginative geographies, according to Italiano. When the Jesuit missionaries set foot in China to proselytize, their translations of Western anatomies for Chinese readers and of Chinese medicine texts for Western readers opened up new spaces and new imaginative geographies. This talk today will first present the different inclinations of the two medical systems. First, the inward and abstract mapping of a Chinese body and the outward and visual presentation of a Western body, and then examine how the Jesuit missionary translators crossed the linguistic and cultural barriers to perceive the space of a human body via the languages and terminologies in their translations. It aims to present the Jesuits' efforts navigating through different medical systems on a shared space of body while facing criticism and misunderstanding from two differently oriented medical systems and philosophies. While There are indeed exchanges upon very different presumptions of the nature and image of a body and the transfer of knowledge via the Jesuit translations. That does not mean that the knowledge so exchanged was received as it was transmitted. Then it comes to my second part. Okay, so it is the inner world mapping and inner landscape of Chinese body. Each culture's voxy and perspectives are unique, and when juxtaposed, such differences may lead to different perceptions or interpretations of a very same bodily space. In China, Chinese doctors, unlike Western doctors, did not see the body as expressing the perfection of nature or the divine design of God. The Chinese body was perceived through the understanding of the correspondences between the macrocosm and microcosm, involving notions of yin and yang and the five faces. This section of the human body was especially regarded as an act of filial piety. One of a few clearly depicted drawings of the inside of human body is the Neijing Tu, the diagram of an inner rim. You can see from this figure, which is a Taoist inner landscape diagram of a human body illustrating Neidan, the inner alchemy, Wuxing, five faces, yin and yang, in Chinese mythology. Without vivid depiction of organs and veins like one would see in Western anatomy, this illustration with mountains, rivers, paths, forests, and stars mapped the imaginary geography of a human body through analogy. From the above description, it might be seen that the general principles of clinical treatment in Chinese medicine relied upon the observation of the appearance, tone, and complexions to render a possible diagnosis of these diseases inside the body. Chinese doctors treated this particular transparency in the inside of a human body as an open space. They depended upon the external features to diagnose the internal diseases without any surgical procedures. That's the reason why the Europeans felt so astonished, even incredulous, about Michael Boehm's Latin translation of Mo-Jue, Manual of Chinese Pulse, when it began to circulate in Europe. In their first encounter with Chinese medicine and the Chinese perception of a human body, Jesuit missionaries were amazed. In their later translations, they aimed to persuade the European readers that Chinese medicine had achieved a high standard of healing, but the responses from European readers were quite the opposite to the Jesuit missionaries or translators' expectations. Europeans also thought of it as experience-oriented rather than science-based and even shamanistic. The European reception of Chinese medicine translations will be further elaborated in the later parts of my talk. Now here comes to the main part of my talk today, overlapping of a Western and Chinese bodies, a commendation in Boehm's Latin translation. One of the earliest translators of Chinese medicine was a Jesuit, Michael Boehm, a son of a Polish king's physician. He was also the first person to translate and introduce to the West the Huangdi Neijing and Mo Jing, Canon of Pulses, two works of Chinese medicine which he translated into Latin and collected in Specimen Medicinae Sinacae. This is a manuscript stored in our library. A look at the medicine of China and Clavis Medica, key to the medical doctrine of the Chinese on the pulse. In Western medicine, the functions of the body organs are explained by reference to anatomy and physiological function. However, in Chinese medicine, the mechanisms of blood, fluid, organs, and the whole body follow the principle of yin and yang and qi and five phases, principles which might be described as invisible in Western medicine and anatomy. In Michael Boehm's translations of Chinese medicine and the body, the mysterious internal framework of Chinese medicine was turned inside out, if I can put it that way, to externalize the body in the Chinese tradition clearly through descriptions and drawings, and in that way match the Western tradition of outward perception. So you can see from these two figures, one such example of inside out may be seen from Boehm's translation of Pulse in the manuscript called Specimen Medicinae Sinacae, the manuscript stored in our library. In this work, Boehm added his own praise to the high achievements of Chinese medicine and pulse taking, as well as its clinical effects. Apparently, without a preference for Western medicine and anatomy, Boehm clearly explained the difference between Galenic theory and Chinese way of pulse taking. Boehm chose texts from 黄帝内经 and 墨诀 and clarified the diagnosis by taking the pulse was not invented by Galen. The Western style of taking the pulse always only check one place, only check one pulse location with one hand. But Chinese doctors check both hands and place fingers on 3 places, which are 寸 upper, 关 medium, and 尺 lower. The different qualities of a pulse, floating or sunken, discerned by the fingers, helped the Chinese doctors with the diagnosis and particular treatments targeting certain illnesses. Boehm was amazed by this pulse-taking technique, and he visualized the pulse for the Western readers. You can see from the previous figures. The source of the pulse images might be from 图注脉诀辨真, authored by Zhang Shixian, a renowned Ming physician. In the earliest translations of Chinese medical texts, Boehm also introduced Chinese medical theory of correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm, without providing explanations of the methods and diagnosis of Chinese medicine. Boehm frequently supplied information about Chinese philosophy. He was the earliest European author to notice that Chinese treated the human body as the microcosmos. In Boehm's work, you can see over here the treatise on the pulse. He divided the human body into 3 metaphorical regions. The parts of the upper body are like clouds, the middle brooks, and below lakes and ponds, which are formed by the brooks. These metaphors and inward-looking perceptions remind us of his association with Neijing Tu, if you still remember the very first illustration I provided. On the other hand, Boehm, looking to increase the reception of his translations, also adopted terminology familiar to Western readers. Boehm translated the Chinese term yang and yin into catidum innatum, which means inner heat, and humidum radical moisture, 2 concepts that have been central to Western philosophical and medical traditions since Greek antiquity. Innate heat, a fundamental concept in Galenic medicine, refers to physiological heat that is vital for the living beings, produced by the heart and the circulatory system. Inner heat drives the vital and organic functions of a human body. Acting as an instrument of the soul, it animates the body in a way similar to a bodily flame. On the other hand, radical moisture was understood as matter. It was seen as the enduring material element of the body. At birth, each person was given a specific and fixed amount of radical moisture, which decided the length of his or her lifespan. Though Boehm borrowed these 2 terms, Western practitioners deemed the practice of Chinese medicine ridiculous. While reviewing Boehm's work on Chinese medicine in 1686, one philosopher named Pierre Bayer poked fun at the Jesuits' belief to have found the metaphysical entities in the heats and radical moisture in faraway China. The early efforts in translating Chinese medicine and the body were not well reviewed or accepted in the sphere of Western medicine. Another example of Boehm's effort to fit the Chinese medical concepts into the Western medical context lies in Zang and Fu. Of the mechanism within Chinese medicine, there are 五脏六腑, 5 yin organs and 6 yang organs, known as Zang and Fu. Yin organs are thought to have more internal functions and are called interior organs. The yin organs include the liver, heart, spleen, lungs, and kidneys. Zang are the yin organs, and they take their name from the Chinese character 藏, long-term depart, which suggests that this Zang lie deep inside the body and were dedicated to a long-term depositing the resources such as qi, blood, and body fluids. The 6 yang organs are the gallbladder, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, bladder, and triple burner, 三焦. The yang organs, on the other hand, are believed to have more external functions and are considered exterior organs. Fu are the young organs and take their name from the Chinese character fu, short-term repositories. The young organs are mainly responsible for digesting food and transmitting nutrients to the body. However, interestingly, in the Clavis Medica, Boehm acknowledged the yin and yang organ characterization, but transformed them into the medical terminology of Western medicine. He called Zang members and Fu intestines. And you can see the following is his Latin translation, and this is my English translation of his Latin translation. Due to time limit, I'm not going to go further into that. Interestingly, Zang, you can see the yin organs in Chinese medicine is translated as members, which are solid, actually, 实行器官, while Fu, the young organs, is translated as intestines, which are hollow, 空心器官. In Chinese tradition, solidness is always associated in quality with yang and holiness with yin. In Boehn's translation, the concept of members, which are solid, are explained as yin organs, and intestines, which are hollow, are explained as yang organs. It is the reverse of a concept of yin and yang in Chinese medicine. It does not necessarily mean that Boehm misunderstood the yin and yang organs. The modifications might have been intended to accord with the existing terminology and medical system of Western medicine. In order to do another interesting comparison, especially restored rare manuscripts in our library, here I would like to present another case of a manuscript stored in Bibliothèque Nationale de France, National Library of France, inside our visual presentation of Manchu anatomy. In the early Qing dynasty, the French Jesuits played a pivotal role in introducing Western science and knowledge, including Western anatomy, to China. Here, this manuscript is Dominic Perronin's translation of Western anatomy into Manchu. His translation was based on Pierre Dionne's The Anatomy of Man Following the Circulation of the Blood and the Latest Discovery, published in 1706. And the drawings were based on Thomas Bothling's The Anatomy in 1677. In this regard, Perronin's translation called 格体全录 was not only a translation of a Western body and anatomy into Manchu, but also an outward visual representation which tried to broaden the vision of Chinese readers, more specifically, the emperor. Visual representation acted as another medium of translation, and in the 格体全录 and anatomical drawings were traces of accommodation and compromise to cater to the medical perspective of the Chinese people. First, the order matches the traditional order when describing the Chinese body, starting from the head and neck, then moving down to the upper limbs and shoulders, and then to the spinal cord and lower limbs, and lastly, to the viscera. The order of a viscera also follows the order of a 五脏六腑 in 黄帝内经. Secondly, in 周身血脉图, a chart of the blood and veins of a whole body, no bones were drawn, while the bone structure of the entire body was depicted vividly in the original drawings by Thomas Bothling. This was an intentional manipulation and concession to a secular power to a Kangxi emperor, because Perronin intentionally left out the bone structure to meet the demands of the emperor. In addition, the male and female reproductive organs were strategically covered. You can see from the picture. The hairstyle and outfit of humans, you can see the picture on the right-hand side in the drawings, were also intended to represent the Manchu people, including the shirts with high collar and a specific fold pattern. Perronin's translation revealed the Jesuits' plan to demonstrate the divine design of God and to apply Jesuits' anatomical knowledge to Chinese bodies and Chinese healing. However, the domineering Kangxi emperor had his own agenda. In the beginning, Perronin had the full support of the emperor. However, the striking, vivid details in the muscles and veins eventually changed the intention of the Kangxi emperor, who decided not to publish them. The Jesuits' intention of revealing God's divine design may have been detected by the Kangxi emperor, whose interests in Western anatomy were superseded by his eagerness for monopoly and secular power over Western learning. After it was completed, this translation, Geti Quanlu, was transcribed into 3 copies and stored in the Imperial Library, the Qing Court, not to be read by the Chinese people or literati. In order not to waste his efforts, of course, you can see Perronin indeed paid a lot of efforts on drawing this. And then he sent his personal copies back to France. Despite its restricted circulation, the Geti Quanlu should not be ignored because it is one of the early examples of disseminating Western anatomical knowledge in China and the first to use Manchu as the medium for Western anatomy. So here comes to my conclusion. The imaginative geography of a Chinese body and the Western body in the Jesuit translations illuminates scientific exchange between early modern Europe and China. During one of the first encounters between the inward perception of Chinese medical tradition and the outward vivid depiction of Western anatomy, incoordination inevitably arose. And the Jesuits thus took different translation approaches. Their translations reveal their theological agenda, their accommodation, and the dilemmas they faced. Michael Boehm's Latin translation introduced Chinese medicine, the body, and the pulse to Western readers, but it was belittled and disdained. However, after being circulated in Europe, Boehm's translation of the ancient art of interpreting pulse became the basis of John Foyer's future research upon the beating of a pulse and his invention of a pulse watch. Then, in Dominic Perronin's translation, Geti Quanlu, we see the tug of war between the theological perspective of a Jesuit translator and the secular power of a Chinese emperor. Perronin eventually succumbed to the secular power, but it was admittedly the first attempt of translating Western anatomy in Manchu. These translations leave us with fascinating reminders of exchanges on the mapping of the body of China and the West, marking the very first encounters of the 2 long and hallowed medical traditions. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wei. We have 2 very fascinating lectures, one on something very big and visible, elephant, and the second very abstract and appealing to our imagination, the pulse, the Chinese perception of pulse. So now the third lecturer, the third speaker would be Professor Elizabeth Cossey. And she has, she managed to join us. Yes, great. Yeah, but because previously she worried about the technical barrier and kindly provide us with a recorded video. But now she is with us in Zoom in real time. So Professor Cossey, and her topic would be Jesuits, books, and cultures of text in early modern China. Welcome, Professor Cossey.
Thank you. Yes, my presentation is being recorded, but if you can hear me, I would first like to thank the organizers for inviting me, in particular Professor McManus, for this invitation. And it is a privilege to be able to participate in this event and to celebrate the anniversary of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. My presentation, unfortunately, was a bit too long, but I hope you've been able to make it shorter. Thank you. Can you hear me? And I shall start my presentation now. Traditionally, historiography attributes a decisive role to the printing press in initiating modernity in Europe, although scholars are still reluctant to admit that it was not an exclusively European enterprise. In the mid-16th century, when the first Jesuit missionaries entered China, they were deeply struck by the vibrancy of the Chinese publishing world, the low cost of books and their wide distribution, and did not fail to account for it in the reports they periodically sent to Europe.
In several books on exhibition at the library of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, one can find a few such references. Let us consider, for example, Juan González de Mendoza's Historia de las cosas más notables, ritos y costumbres del Gran Reino de China, the first book ever printed in Europe on the history of China, as well as Jean-Baptiste Duhalde, General History of China. Both Mendoza and Duhalde extolled the technical accuracy of the Chinese printing. Unfortunately, such sources have long circulated only among sinologists, but have had little impact on book historians. As has been rightly noted, until historians of the book in Europe become fully acquainted with the level of sophistication and complexity achieved by Chinese printers long before Gutenberg, a true dialogue between book historians in Europe and book historians in China cannot take place. This presentation attempts to offer a contribution to the construction of this dialogue by looking at the Jesuit project of integrating the curriculum for access to the civil service in China, revisited from the perspective of book history. Although the project remained unfinished, the presence of Jesuit text in Chinese in imperial and private library collections, as well as the numerous reprints, indicate that missionaries were able to interact fruitfully with Chinese literati, even at the cost of generating misunderstandings with respect to their initial intentions. A few cases in point will be shown. The presentation concludes with an invitation to adopt a less self-referential way of looking at cross-cultural contacts and to examine these misunderstandings not as failures, but as creative appropriations generating new knowledge. Let us look at two portraits of Emperor Kangxi at two different moments in his life. As we can see, the paintings depict him in the guise of a man of letters, a Chinese literatus wearing the unadorned blue robe of the man of letters who lives among books, sitting in his library as if meditating or while practicing writing, tracing characters on sheets of soft, absorbent paper. This way of representing imperial dignity is by no means unusual in Chinese tradition and arguably underlines the close relationship between culture and power, a persisting feature of Chinese imperial autocracy. Kangxi, a Manchurian son of the steppes of Central Asia, portrayed in the guise of the man of letters, embodies that process of transformation to which most rulers of non-Chinese origin who succeeded on the throne over the centuries have gone through. In a recent article, Kai Wing-chou argued that Emperor Qianlong, in spite of his being adamant in maintaining what he considered the essence of Manchu identity, Manchu language and hunting, was so captured by Chinese poetry that he could not restrain himself from writing poems in Chinese. The Jesuit missionaries also fell victims to the enticement of Chinese culture and began to dress like members of the elite. Some of them even held public offices, mostly in the service of the emperor, accompanying him on inspection missions to various places in the empire or acting as interpreters. In return for the services to the crown, some of them received honors and official grades, securing support during their lifetime and sumptuous funerals at their end. By the time Kangxi ascended the throne, the Jesuits had already been at court for 60 years. They ran the astronomical observatory in the imperial city and served regularly in a variety of capacities, including that of tutor to the young ruler. They've had time to acclimatize, to study the language, to develop a strategy that has the book and the written word as its cornerstone. By that time, the Jesuits had established colleges and seminaries in Europe and had become the educators of the elite. Colleges ran by Jesuit fathers had sprung up in the Americas, in Goa and Macau, in Funai and Nagasaki, although the latter were short-lived due to the anti-Christian persecutions that began in Japan after the first decade of the 17th century. This global network of higher education institutions was regulated by the Ratio Studiorum, which acted as a connective tissue and encouraged the mobility of lecturers, a fact that significantly contributed to the circulation of books and ideas. Scholars like Kai-Win Cho, Joseph McDermott, and Cynthia Brokaw have challenged the idea, still widely held by book historians, that printing and paper, though invented in China, were only technologically improved in Europe, and that only Europe was able to use them as the engine that set modernity in motion. This presentation attempts to offer a contribution to the critique of these assumptions by highlighting the circumstances that led Jesuit missionaries to undertake the remarkable task of producing written knowledge in Chinese on a broad variety of subjects beyond the religious ones. The main objective of this enterprise was to integrate the curriculum for the training of civil servants with Aristotelian natural philosophy. This project remained unfinished for two main reasons. Firstly, because China already had well-established educational institutions that benefited from the low cost and availability of books. And secondly, because the effectiveness of the bureaucratic recruitment system in early modern China was sanctioned by an established practice whereby the government did not see the need to introduce innovation into the curriculum of candidates. However, the Jesuits' endeavor of transmitting European scientific knowledge was not limited only to a few intellectuals and converts, but thanks to the flourishing network of small publishing centers, both public and private, dotting the territory of the Chinese Empire, reached a larger audience and stimulated production of new knowledge. Although books play an important role in many missionary contexts and are by no means unique to the Society of Jesus, they are the hallmark of the Chinese Jesuit mission. Books are its distinguishing feature, not only because the mission is not situated in a colonial context, but above all, because it is embedded in what Craig Clunas had called cultures of text. Indeed, as Clunas pointed out, during the Ming period, that is when missionaries first reached the southern areas of the country, China was permeated by the presence of the written word to such an extent that it was unparalleled by any other culture in the world. One would be tempted to apply the seductive definition of graphosphere to mean China, were it not for the fact that, however witty, even Régis Debray, in defining the three ages of logosphere, graphosphere, and videosphere, falls into the usual stereotype of, and I quote, a calligraphic East, a printed Europe, a widescreen America, end quote. In order to understand the reasons that led the China Jesuits to conceive of the project of integrating the curriculum for admission to public service, as well as its partial failure, it is necessary to dwell, albeit briefly, on the context in which the project originated and to highlight the areas in which the cultures of text in the Ming period are better expressed. I will therefore both consider the production of texts in Ming China and outline the characteristics of the apostolate through print undertaken by the Jesuits in China. Writing and the production of written texts, both in printing and manuscript forms, were cultivated at all levels of Ming society, among the elite, of course, but also among the popular classes, including merchants. Therefore, one of the leading scholars of book history, Kai Wenzhou, speaks of the Shishan elite, composed of literati and merchants. Already, Francis Xavier, in a few letters sent from India to Ignatius of Loyola between January and April 1552, showed that he was aware of the importance of culture and books in China. He wrote to Ignatius that China is a peaceful and well-governed country, and that the Chinese are muy ingeniosos y muy dados a estudiar, as well as muy deseosos de saber, eager to acquire knowledge, to the point that el que más letrado es más hidalgo, the gentlemen are the more learned among the people. It is on these premises that he conceives the idea of establishing a mission in China, especially since, he says, people of different faiths coexist there, a condition considered favorable to evangelization. Thus, the awareness of the primacy of knowledge in China originated with the founders of the society. However, Alessandro Valignano and Niccolò Longobardo are the ones who played a decisive part in the future of the mission in Asia. Valignano could not have known the extent to which intellectual life was flourishing in China when he ordered that a printing press be sent along with the young Japanese ambassadors returning home in 1587. According to Valignano's predictions, once it arrived in Japan, the press, which had been put into operation in Goa and Macau, was to be used to print a large quantity of works in Latin for students of Jesuit colleges. Indeed, until 1611, when the persecution of Christians in Japan began, the books that would form the Kirishtan Bunko had been printed in Nagasaki and Amakusa. In its early years, movable typefaces that had been sent from Rome were used to print works in Latin, Portuguese, or Romanized Japanese, but proved to be unsuited for printing in Japanese kana in association with kanji. For this reason, wooden types were produced for both kana and kanji, later replaced by metal types. It isn't clear whether these were the metallic types from Korea, such as those used to print books produced under the auspices of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Since movable type printing of Chinese graphs was expensive and time-consuming, the missionaries decided to resort to the printing method more widely used by both public and commercial publishers in China, that is, woodblock printing. This is why Valignano's printing press, which had been moved to Macau, fell into disuse, as books in Latin and other languages could also be conveniently printed using wood blocks. Eminent historians of the book have interpreted this as a result of the perceived inadequacy of ideographic writing for printing using movable types. Lucien Febvre and Henri Jean Martin argued that the failure of movable type printing in China was due not only to the peculiarity of Chinese writing with its thousands of complex graphs, but also to the poor quality of the ink. In the same vein, Marshall McLuhan argued that, and I quote, the Chinese ideogrammic script proved a complete block against the development of print technology in the culture. Elizabeth Eisenstein reiterated the advantages of alphabetic over ideographic writing. Finally, Jonathan Bloom argued that although paper was invented in China, it did not foster the development of a literate society as it did in the Arab world in the early 9th century. In other words, the Chinese and consequently also the Japanese and Koreans would not have used paper as a writing medium or for printing books. Such claims reflect strong prejudices as well as a Eurocentric view of scientific and technological development. Judgments like the one made by McLuhan may have been, to some extent, justified in 1962 when the Gutenberg's Galaxy was published, but they would be unacceptable today, given the richness of scholarship on printing and publishing in China and Japan. Elizabeth Eisenstein herself, 28 years after the printing revolution, recognized the need for a holistic view of book history that takes into account regional variations and compares them. In fact, she states that, and I quote, "The different forms taken by print culture throughout the world seem to be especially suitable for comparative collaborative work." Scholars such as Roger Chartier and Peter Burke were particularly receptive of Eisenstein's invitation, arguing for a more inclusive view of the so-called print revolution and the reconsideration of print's role as an agent of social transformation on a global scale. In a letter dated February 18, 1598, addressed to the General Claudio Acquaviva, Niccolò Longobardo reaches a future successor to the direction of the Jesuit mission in China, writes from Beijing. That need we have for books is the same need we have for images in order to console and help the new Christians. Above all, a few of these books that our Father Nadal made with the mysteries of the life of Christ will be of great consolation and profit to us, so that when these mandarins come to visit, attracted by the fame of the Europeans, we can show them something that will immediately give us the opportunity to sow what is needed in this mission. These books are considered here to be very artificial and subtle, and to have shadows which the Chinese paintings do not hold. Wherefore, one of those governors came here the other day and seeing a little book containing the mysteries of the life of our Lord Jesus was astonished and wanted me to give it to him. But it seemed to me unbecoming to give it into the hands of a Gentile. So I told him that this was a book of our Jiao, that is, of the law which we profess. He replied that I was right and asked me to give him some others that were not so necessary. So I presented him with an illustrated copy of Aesop's fables, which he accepted with both hands and thanked me several times as if it were the best work of Flanders. End quote. This letter is one of the first in a series of petitions aimed at the establishment of a library to draw on for the work of evangelization, but also to maintain relations with local officials on an equal footing. It should not be forgotten, however, that the library's main purpose was to carry out the ambitious project of integrating the Chinese curriculum with the Aristotelian nature of philosophy, as taught in Jesuit colleges through the Commentari Collegi Coimbricensis, compiled at the College of Coimbra between 1591 and 1606. Created to replace the time-consuming practice of dictation, the commentaries offered students the opportunity of a new learning experience that emphasized understanding conceptual issues and the ability to maintain their veracity in public disputes without neglecting textual and philological problems. The first commentary to see the light of the day was on Aristotle's Physics, the content of which can be found in works such as the Xingxue Zushu by Giulio Aleni. The translators of the Aristotelian corpus were Francisco Furtado, Alfonso Vagnone, Giulio Aleni, Francesco Sambiase. Later, Ferdinand Verbiest would be the main architect of the project to introduce a course of philosophy into the Chinese educational system, a project that was destined to remain unfinished, although the emergence of the Caozhan school, pragmatic and textual evidence school, during the Qing period can be seen in relation to the work of the Jesuits in disseminating European knowledge. The diplomatic mission of Nicolas Trigault to Europe made it possible to form the first nucleus of the missionary library, consisting of the so-called Bibliotheca Pontificia, donated by Paul V in 1615. It was joined by a mathematical library, a collection of music books, and a series of volumes collected during Trigault's academic peregrination at Jesuit colleges in Europe. Through these lots, Trigault also managed to add 331 volumes purchased from the Officina Plantiniana of the extraordinary library that the Jesuit would establish. About 30% has survived, now preserved in the manuscript and rare book room at the National Library in Beijing and described in a catalogue compiled in the early 20th century by the Lazarist father Hubert Verhaeren. The collection, which includes some rarities such as the Modo de Enseñar la Doctrina Cristiana by Diego de Ledesma, published by Antonio Blado in Rome, 1573, served mainly as a working library for missionaries, although, as we read on Longobardi's letter, the rarest and most valuable editions were shown to visiting mandarins in order to show off the technical expertise of European printers. The fact that religious missionary orders use text production as support for their evangelization work is far from being a phenomenon confined to Chinese Catholic missions. When, for example, the Jesuits traveled to the Guarani in South America, they did not hesitate to initiate an intensive production of grammars and dictionaries that had a decisive impact in facilitating the adoption of an alphabetic script by the indigenous population, until then accustomed to oral culture. In this way, the missionary enterprise acquired a demiurgic character insofar as it ordered the linguistic space, history, and memory of the population. What distinguished the textual production of Catholic missionaries in China from the experience described above, however, is the fact that missionary texts in Chinese are written in a complex and sophisticated language known as Guanhua, that is, the semi-vernacular language in use for centuries among members of the elite. Language is not the only obstacle to the missionaries' adaptation to Chinese intellectual life. The very composition of the text proves to be a challenge, since it has to take into account centuries-old editorial norms, a demanding readership, and a flourishing and locally differentiated publishing market. It is a situation that missionaries do not hesitate to compare with that of Europe, but which, unlike Europe, requires them to learn new rules and practices. When the missionaries arrived in China, the relationship with antiquity through books, epigraphic inscriptions, and material evidence was an integral part of the cultural practices of the elite, and Jesuits had to conform to it if they were to gain proper recognition. Inventories of Jesuit libraries in China offer valuable insights as to the works the missionaries used to compile their Chinese texts. An inventory of the works published up to that time was compiled by Philippe Couplet in 1647. And it includes 125 works on theological subjects and 89 works on scientific matters, especially astronomy. However, the inventories of missionaries' libraries in China do not exhaust the range of possible sources because missionary correspondence contains countless references to works not included in them. Traditional society in China attaches paramount importance to written culture, as we already pointed out. In imperial times, there were associations called Hui, whose purpose was to collect waste paper containing written text so that it could be burned in a ritual manner in special ovens designed for this purpose. When Matteo Ricci reached Nanjing, the southern capital of the Ming, in 1598, he was impressed by the city's vibrant cultural life. Commercial printing houses, among which are the Shijintan and the Shidetan, vied for the preeminence of the tastes of the new class of readers, the Shishan, a class made up of middle-ranking officials from wealthy merchant families whose cultural consumption diverged in part from that of the Confucian elite who held the highest positions in public service. Ricci and his confreres took advantage of their intellectual curiosity and interacted with them mainly through disputes on issues of religion and philosophy. It is thus at the level of so-called cultural civility that Jesuit missionaries identified with Chinese men of letters, Wenzhen. It is at the level of bibliophilia, collecting, bricolage, and exegesis that European Jesuits and Chinese literati entered into dialogue. The former called themselves Literati Europei, as it appears in a copy of an account signed by Claudio Filippo Grimaldi and Tomás Pereira that I found in the provincial archives of the Society in Mexico City. It is within the epistemic network of early modern China that the Jesuit missionary activities in China unfolds. It involves constant negotiations between diplomacy and cultural mediation. During such negotiations, misunderstandings can also occur, resulting more often than not from a decontextualization of the cultural elements on which the mediation is based. The case of Ricci, the founder of the Jesuit mission in China, is exemplary. Although much has been written about him, not enough attention has been paid to Ricci's relations with the intellectual circles of the two capitals. Copies of engravings offered by the missionary to the erudite publisher, printer, and ink manufacturer Chen Dayue are reproduced in the Chen Shemuo Yuan. Ricci also wrote a preface to the work, which in total contains as many as 18 prefaces, thus conforming to a fashion which was very much in vogue at the time, namely that of enriching works with prefaces written by the most famous and sought-after literati. The presence of a preface written by Ricci in a text published in Nanjing is certainly an indication of the reputation that the missionary from Macerata had been able to acquire within a few years. But what kind of work is Mr. Chen's Garden of Ink Sticks? It is a catalogue of illustrations for molds using in the manufacture of ink cakes and belongs to a genre of technical artistic literature known as Zhangwu, or of superfluous things, objects related to the scholarly pastime of the literati and collectors of the time. But then, how to explain the presence of religious images in the midst of superfluous things? Perhaps Ricci, trusting in the universal power of those images, believed in their ability to convey to anyone who looked at them something of the underlying message. A similar fate seems to have befallen Giulio Aleni and his translation of the Evangelica Historia Imagines, a collection of images for meditating on the mysteries of the life of Jesus according to the liturgical calendar, published in Antwerp in 1593 by the Typographia Plantiniana. Recent studies have shown that the many re-editions of the Chinese translation of Aleni's work, 天主降生入相经节, explanation of the incarnation and life of the Lord of Heaven, printed in 1637 in the important publishing and paper-making center of Fuzhou, are mainly due to the fact that the work fitted well within a tradition of illustrated texts for meditation produced within Pure Land Buddhism, the main one of which was the Guang Wu Yang Shou Jing, Sutra of the Contemplation of the Eternal Buddha. As is well known, the Jesuits, from the very beginning of their stay in China, elected Confucianism as a doctrine with which to interact, identifying more willingly with the Confucian literati bureaucratic class than with Buddhist monks. Therefore, it is unlikely that Aleni, in choosing to have a Chinese version of Geronimo Nadal's work published, intended to use to his own advantage the possible similarities with the Buddhist tradition of meditation texts, although it cannot be ruled out that he was aware of the existence of that tradition. It is therefore more likely to be the case of misunderstanding, but not unworthy of careful analysis. The study of misunderstandings in intercultural contacts allows us to gain a more dynamic and less one-sided perspective, precisely because misunderstandings are forms of appropriation, of selective adaptation, and not necessarily only deviations from the original message. Therefore, misunderstandings are an essential aspect of the global history of contacts between cultures. Far from having a negative connotation, they serve to understand the different ways in which people respond to external stimuli by linking them to the mental models. In this talk, I have attempted to trace the stages of the Jesuit project of introducing European science and humanistic culture from the perspective of book history. The primary vehicle for this transmission are the Chinese language texts written by the missionaries with the collaboration of Chinese intellectuals and converts. These are short treatises, often written in dialogic form, based on partial translations of the corpus of works collected by the missionaries. Due to time limits, I have dealt only with the first of these, Nicolas Trigault, but his successors should also be mentioned here: Martino Martini, Giovanni Filippo de Marini, Prospero Intorceta, Philippe Couplet, Filippo Grimaldi, François Noël, and Caspar Kastner. As a result of their mediation efforts, they were able to provide the mission with an adequate working library that was up to date and in tune with developments in European scientific culture. Although the primary purpose of the mission was evangelization, the missionaries sought to supplement the curriculum for entry into the bureaucratic profession with the Aristotelian-based natural philosophy taught in all societies' colleges, believing that this was an appropriate means of conveying religious messages. Although the project was not carried out, the presence of Jesuit texts in Chinese in imperial and private library collections, as well as the numerous reprints, indicates that the missionaries were able to interact fruitfully with the country's cultural elite, even at the cost of creating misunderstandings about their initial intentions. examining these misunderstandings not as failures, but as creative appropriation may be a less self-referential way of looking at cross-cultural contacts. Although unfinished, the Jesuit project was an effective intellectual device fueled by the vibrant publishing world of early modern China. Thanks to it, the work of translating European scientific knowledge did not remain an episode limited to a few intellectuals and converts, but thanks to the flourishing network of small publishing centers, both public and private, that dotted the territory of the Chinese Empire, constituted the stimulus for the production of new knowledge. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Cosi. Professor Cosi is Chair of Sinology, Department of History, Cultures, Religious Studies, Visual and Performing Arts in Sapienza, University of Rome. Our fourth speaker is Professor Claudia von Kalani. She's Adjunct Professor of Missiology and Dialogue of Religious of University of Wolfsburg. And her topic is Johann Adam Schall von Bell and his Historica Relatio de Ortu et Progressu Fidei Orthodoxae in Regno Chinensi. So Professor von Kalani is already with us. Let's welcome her, and she'll talk via Zoom. Thank you, Professor von Kalani.
Thank you very much, everybody in Hong Kong, and my best regards to your anniversary. And I will try to contribute a little bit from far Würzburg. So I'm talking about a book which is in your library and which has a special history. The Historica Relatio de Ortu et Progressu Fidei Orthodoxae in Regno Chinensi by Johann Adam Schall von Bell. There are some words about Johann Adam Schall von Bell. He was not only the most important German Jesuit of the China mission, but he has to be seen in one line together with Matteo Ricci and Ferdinand Verbiest as one of the great personalities of the China mission. He served 3 Chinese emperors, namely Zhongzhen, Shunji, and Kangxi. He was the first European in charge of the Directorate of the Tribunal of Astronomy, Qin Tianqian. In this way, he paved the way for later missionaries at the imperial court in Beijing. Schall built the first real church in Beijing in 1615. The Xitang, later called Nantang, he published translations of European books about science. He introduced the telescope in China, and he cast cannon for the Ming Dynasty. Now, Johann Schall von Bell was born into an old colonial patrician family on May 1st in 1592. His father was Heinrich Degenhardt Schall von Bell. His mother was the 3rd wife of the father. Her name was Maria Scheifert von Merode. Schall had his first education in Cologne at the Jesuit grammar school. Then he traveled to Rome as a very young man, and he joined the Jesuits in 1611. After his education in Rome in theology and science, among others under Christoph Greenberger, especially in the calendar science, he was permitted to join Nicolas Trigault, who recruited Jesuits with a scientific education for the China mission. I would have liked to show you some pictures, but it's too complicated for me, excuse me. And we have heard about Nicolas Trigault by Elisabeth Corsi. He was an important man for the calendar reform because he recruited Jesuits in Europe who had an education in astronomy and in science. And he brought them together with books and instruments to China. And Schall was one of these men who was recruited by Trigault and because of his education in Rome. And after their dangerous travel, the group arrived in Macau in 1619. Schall was at first sent to Xi'an as a missionary until the right time would have come. The calendar reform could finally be started by Paul Guangxi and Johannes Schreck. This reform started under the Chongchen Emperor in 1629 and lasted several years. After the death of Schreck and Xu Guangxi, Schall became the leader of the calendar team, consisting of Chinese and European scholars, a first teamwork at that time and very fruitful. They also wrote a series of booklets with text to accompany the calendar reform. They were mostly translations of European scientific books. It was a Chongchen Lishu, the calendar classic of the Chongchen Emperor. The inauguration of the new calendar, however, was postponed several times because the officials were afraid that it could mean the end of the dynasty. And so, but the dynasty changed, we know it, and the Qing dynasty conquered China. And they needed a correct calendar, like the Ming dynasty, as a symbol of their rule. And so they adopted the calendar made by Schall and his team, the Xiyang Li Fang Tinshu, new calendar in Western style. And Schall became the director of the Qin Tianxian, meaning that he was responsible for the calculation of the annual official calendar. At the beginning of the Qing dynasty, Schall also became a kind of friend of the young emperor, Shunqi, and sometimes also his advisor. But Schall's life was not easy. From Chinese side, there were several officials who were not happy that foreigners had the important office of the calendar bureau, and even from European side, he had problems. Some of the other Jesuits in China, especially Gabriel de Magalhães and Louis de Bouillon, had problems with Schall. You see, the Jesuits have a prohibition that Jesuits can take offices outside the order with political power. And they, in their opinion, Schall, as a director of the Astronomical Bureau, had such power. And the other problem was that he worked for the superstitious calendar. There were special days for special actions, and the Chinese looked for the data from things which were considered as superstition in Europe. And this case took 16 years until it was decided from Rome and from the Pope that Schall could keep his office, and because of the best of the mission. And this was a short time before the calendar case started under the minority of the Kangxi Emperor by the Confucian scholar Yang Guangxian. Schall was nearly executed, but he survived by a general amnesty because of several omens which occurred, and by the intervention of the imperial grandmother. He died in the Jesuit residence in Beijing in 1666. In 1668, the Jesuit Ferdinand Baptiste succeeded and managed that Schall was rehabilitated by Kangxi, and he received an official burial. Now, so much about Schall's life, and this is in close connection to the book. Schall's opera were mainly done on the field of science and technology. He was an expert in astronomy, calendar, practical things, the casting of cannon, and so on. Therefore, he left many Chinese books and manuscripts on science and technology. Only some of his works are on religion, as his book Qin Cheng Xuxiang, an illustrated life of Christ, presented to the Chinese emperor. And in contrast to other Jesuits, he left only one book in a Western language, which had 2 editions and 2 translations, and which is the subject of this paper. There are 2 editions in Latin language, and 2 translations, one into German and one into French. And whereas the last one, the French edition, is the most scientific one. The Historica Relatio de Orto de Progresso Fidei Orthodoxi in Regno Chinensi. That means a historical report about the beginning and the progress of the Christian Orthodox faith in China, made by the Jesuit missionaries of 1672, is the only important publication of Schall in a European language. It is a second edition of the original, that was Historica Narratio. It's the same title, besides one word, instead of relatio, it's narratio. That means also report and a narrative. And we may think why they change the title. The reason is in the appendix, we will see. And the second edition has the same text as the first one, but in the appendix was made by Prospero Intercetta. It was added, and Intercetta is a very famous missionary because of his translations of Chinese classical books. And this is a compendiosa narratio de stato missionis chinensis prodigiis que in ultima persecutione contigarunt. It compromises several pages of this book. And now Intercetta's report with missionary lives and so on, it is a kind of continuation of Schall's report. This book has an approbation given by the Jesuit Provincial of Austria, Michael Sikuten, and so he gave the permission to publish the book. And it's dated 1st of September 1665. The dedication of the book was given to a man of nobility, as most Jesuit books in Europe. It is presented to the German Emperor Leopold I, who ruled from 1658 to 1705, King of Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, Archduke of Austria from the House of Habsburg. And we can think that they gave perhaps money for the publication. This dedication to the emperor recommends the Jesuit fathers who brought the manuscript of Schall to Europe, but it's a bit misleading because it says that a very good old man is coming to His Majesty, and so the German translator thought that this was Schall who returned to Europe, but in reality, the manuscript is taken as considered as a kind of old man, an old venerable man who comes to Europe. And the Jesuits in the preface recommends the book to the emperor and ask for his favor. In contrast to Matteo Ricci's famous Expedizione Christiana, Schall is very present in this book, and it's a kind of his own biography and his memoirs in the light of astronomy. The intention of the manuscript was to serve as an apology for Schall's activities at the Bureau of Astronomy. After Xu Guangqi had started the calendar reform together with a team of Chinese and Western scholars, Schall became more and more involved into this project when Xu Guangqi and Johannes Schreck suddenly died. We have heard that the new calendar inauguration was postponed a bit until the dynasty had changed. And so Schall had to defend this kind of work of the Jesuits. We have heard that 2 Jesuits, Magellange and Bulio, were very uncontent with Schall's activities at the Bureau of Astronomy, and they worked against him with many with rumor and accusations and so on, and made his life complicated. And other orders, like the Dominicans, were against this method of using a calendar or astronomy for missionary purposes. We all know that the Jesuit missionary method of accommodation consists also in indirect mission by science, art, and technology. And this was used by Schall, and he was the first one who really used it and made it popular in China. And now this book has to make it popular in Europe too, and to defend this method. Schall had started to write his memoirs in Beijing, and as an apology and his method, and also some honors given to his parents and grandparents by the Shunxi Emperor are important in this context. It's an approbation of his method. And this manuscript of the book was finished in 1658. Now the problem of the manuscripts. We are not sure how many manuscripts are existing about this book, and at least, excuse me, there are at least three manuscripts, and one copy in Schall's handwriting was brought to Macau by Giovanni Filippo Marini in 1659, and later it was sent to the Asciuta in Lisbon. And this copy is entitled Historica Relatio Eorium que Contingunt Occasione Constatazioni Calendari Esilici. It means the historical relation about the calendar and so on. Another one of these manuscripts was brought to Rome about 1659 and 1660. And I'm not sure who was the one who brought it. And there was another copy sent to Rome, this time by two Jesuits. This copy was made by Johann Gruber, an Austrian Jesuit, who stayed for some time in Beijing as a kind of assistant of Schall. And this copy is not complete, but it ends within a word in chapter 16, because Gruber had suddenly to start his travel to Europe. And when Gruber and his companion came to Europe, the print of the first manuscript had already started, and they contributed other information, and especially the dedication to the emperor. Gruber was another important man. He was sent to explore the ways through the continent for the Jesuits to avoid the dangerous way on the seaside. And he traveled, the first Jesuit to travel through through Tibet, and also they had with him the manuscript of Schall. And they traveled through India with Heinrich Roth, and then finally to Rome in 1664. And so he made additions to the manuscript, which had already started to print, and the manuscript in Vienna was, what to say, a Jesuit humanist named Johann Foresi changed the style from Schall's more simple style to a more elaborate one with humanistic expressions, but he also misread many Chinese words and so on. So it's not very correct, but people in Europe didn't notice, of course. And so there led to some misunderstandings. The second edition is in this way not Historica Narratio, but Historica Relatio, appeared 3 years later. It has the same arrangement and the same text, but another format. And also the same dedication to the emperor, but this time it's followed, as I already mentioned, by the narratio of Intercetta. And this print was made in Regensburg, another important city for European printing. And yes, now we have a third edition of this book, this time a German translation made in the beginning of the 19th century from 1834. It appeared also in Vienna, and yes, the Manzek, it was made by Ignaz Manzek, and he had the misunderstandings that Schall had to join to Europe, as I already said, and it appeared in the course of the new awakening of the Catholic mission in Europe, and in this way it paved the way to the mission. And now I will shorten a little bit. There's a fourth edition, this time a French translation made by Paul Bornet and edited by Henri Bernard, who worked about Schall. And they used the Ashuta manuscript. So they had made correct Chinese terms and definitions. And it's a classical scientific edition. They also wanted to continue their work on Schall, but they couldn't. There was war and so on and so on. And this book appeared in, let me see, 1942 in Tianjin in China. Now some words as a resume. Paul Belliot, the French Jesuit, said that Schall's La personnalité la plus forte et ancienne mission de Chine après Matteo Ricci, the most important personality after Matteo Ricci, with a strange character, but he played a very important role at the imperial court, and so he remained Chinese history. And Schall belonged to the inner circle in Beijing, and so he was liked by the emperor, but he was accused because of his arrogance and his living style. But we have still his memories in his book, which was published several times in Europe and in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Perk and all speakers. And now we're going to have a Q&A session for the first panel. May I invite Professor Perk Wing-Kin, Professor Nian-Min Huang, and Professor Suvi Ling-Chia Wei to come forward to take the stage, please. And may also Professor Claudia Fonconani, Professor Elisabetta Corsi also join the discussion via Zoom, please. Now I would like to invite Professor Perk Wing-Kin to facilitate the discussion. Professor Perk, please.
Thank you everyone for your tremendous presentations. I have a lot of questions I'd love to ask all of you. But maybe just to allow us to cast our minds back to the beginning of the panel, I might ask Professor Wang a quick question. Did observers notice anything about those who looked after the elephants? I know in earlier periods there were the so-called black elephant slaves, the Daxiang Kunlunlu or something like that. What about in this later period? Because of course elephants to survive in Beijing would require careful attention, I would imagine. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor McManus. Thank you for the question. Actually, it's a topic, another paper that I'm currently working on. It's a huge topic because you probably know that the elephants not just coming from the Xi'an, but also Laos, Nanjing, which is Luang Prabang, and other South Asian countries. It's very difficult to walk elephant from southwest border of Yunnan to Beijing, which will require at least 3 months or more than 3 months, sometimes 6 months walk and water transportation is very complicated. As you probably know that Beijing still it's very cold and terrible climate in the winter. So according to my calculation, I did a thorough calculation of the entire 18th century. There were, if I'm not mistaken, roughly between 90 to 94 elephants arrived Beijing. Not like a giraffe, which it's considered as a mythical animal, never arrived the main court, but only the image. But there were 90 to 95 elephants arrived Beijing throughout the entire 18th century. The majority of them died because of different reasons. Nobody cared about them. Nobody looked after them. There were imperial stable where elephants are kept, used as the elephant circus when foreign ambassadors or like foreign envoy, when Korean people came, they organized or ran such kind of a display of circus. That's it. And there was annually in Beijing, there was like so-called elephant bathing festival. The elephants from the imperial stable has been driven and brought to the river at the southwest corner of Imperial City to demonstrate that all Asian elephants paid tribute to the Qing. As kind of staging or displaying the muscle, the power and authority of the Qing Empire. But in the end, when I look at what really happened, is an environmental disaster in the 18th century. Elephants were giving so-called elephant straw, but elephant, as we know, they ate fruits, grains, different kinds of foods, not only straw, but they were only provided with elephant straw every day. So that's the reason why the Qing Empire, the court, demanded every 2 years or 3 years, they sent a message to the Yunnan authority saying, we need more elephants, we need more elephants. I was very curious. Why are people so concerned about elephants? There were enough elephants in the Qing stable. When I look at the statistic, it says it's died. 95% of elephants died. It's terrible in the 18th century. So it's not only a story about how Qing practiced their power in the southwest frontier, but also a history of environmental disaster in the 18th century. I hope I partially answered your question.
So thank you. Any question?
One question of mine, once again, a very interesting presentation. You were talking a lot about imitation of Mongol court use elements. To what extent was there direct contact? I mean, did the Mongols present elephants as presents or anything like that? So there was no direct connection, it was just imitating the...
Well, as far as I know, maybe someone else can answer the question, but as far as I know, there were diplomatic relation between the Mongol and China, exactly. But there's some kind of exchange of small, scared diplomatic gifts, textile, metalworks, but not elephant. The only Mughal elephant was called Hanno and brought to Lisbon in the 16th century, and which, the arrival of elephant kind of conjured the European imagination and sentiment of Alexander the Great, conqueror of India. But there was, as far as I know, no direct exchange of elephant between these two countries in the early modern period.
So, any question? Any comment? Actually, because we are a bit over time, we still have another session to go. So, may I suggest we stop here for a break, and our second panel will start at 4:10. Or
Yes, thank you all for the questions and thank you all speakers. And now it's time for a coffee break, and please come back 10 minutes later here. So we will start at like 10 minutes later. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, panel 2, translating between China and the West, now begins. The second panel, we have 3 presentations, and Professor James Morton Department of History, CUHK, will be the moderator. Professor Martin, please.
All right. Thank you very much. Since our afternoon panel is going to be, as you can see, entirely online here, unfortunately, we couldn't bring any of our speakers directly to Hong Kong for this session. I will be sitting myself here for the duration of the afternoon. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all. First of all, we have Mr. Rossman Krief, Examination Fellow at All Souls College at the University of Oxford. Then he will be followed by Dr. William Poole, Fellow in English and Senior Tutor of New College, also at the University of Oxford. And then Professor Eugenio Menegon, Associate Professor of History at Boston University, who sadly can't be with us in person this afternoon, but has nonetheless provided us with, I believe, a video presentation. As you have heard, first of all, we will have the 3 talks, and then they will be followed by a question and answer session. So with no more further ado, please welcome Mr. Rossman Krief, who will be talking on the theme of overthrowing the Tartar tyranny, British understandings of Manchu-Chinese relations and Sino-British diplomacy from the Macartney Embassy to the First Opium War.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's very nice to be here, even if only virtually. And yeah, thanks very much to Stuart McManus for inviting me to speak here today. Let me just try and share my PowerPoint presentation with you. Just give me 1 second whilst I attempt to do that. There we go. Is that visible?
Yes, we can see it perfectly. Well,
fantastic. Thank you very much. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, I can see it perfectly, but I see. Okay, now I think it's good. Yes.
Okay, it's not overly important. It's more just some nice pictures, including, of course, this first one of a rather famous Chinese monument that I suspect we're all rather familiar with. Okay, so accounts of China's Great Wall are a commonplace in European travel literature on China, both pre-modern and contemporary. No exception to this rule is Aeneas Anderson's account of the Macartney Embassy of 1793, which was the earliest account to be published on the mission's return to Britain, and is, of course, one of the texts which makes up the CUHK collections, which are the basis of this conference. Anderson's work gives a general narrative of the embassy, whilst also describing various features of the country he travelled through. And, like many visitors to China, both historical and modern, one of the things that impressed Anderson the most was the Great Wall, depicted here by the artist William Alexander, who accompanied the Macartney Embassy, although actually William Alexander himself never saw the wall. He based his painting on secondhand accounts given by the other members of the embassy. So Anderson calls the Great Wall the most stupendous work ever produced by man. And he goes on to describe in some detail how the wall was built, its history and its purpose, which is said to be, quote, to defend China's frontier against the Tartars. Now, Tartar was the European name for Central and East Asian peoples, nomadic peoples, sorry, whose lands were thought to stretch from the Caspian Sea eastwards all the way to the Sea of Japan. This category included both the Mongols and the Manchus, though by the late 18th century, it had been realized that there were significant differences between the various groups of Tartars. So coming back to the Great Wall itself, Anderson also talks, however, of how this stupendous work is now mouldering away. The reason for this is simple. According to Anderson, ever since Tartary and China are become one nation, the wall has lost its importance. Anderson's reference here is, of course, to the Manchu conquest of China in the 17th century and the subsequent unification of China and Manchu Tartary. The implication is that, following this Manchu conquest and the establishment of the Qing dynasty, the Chinese and the Manchus have successfully intermingled together, so that there is now no need to maintain the Great Wall, which previously marked the divide between the two empires of Tartary and China. So, in Anderson's words, these two empires had now become one nation. This is not, however, the end of the story. Unmentioned in Anderson's account is an event which happened just after the embassy had crossed the wall. Here we turn to George Staunton's account of the Macartney mission, which is also in the CUHK collection and was published in 1797 as the authoritative account of the mission, written by Macartney's trusted second-in-command. So Macartney's journal was never published. So Macartney, the lead ambassador, his journal was never published. And here you have a portrait of both Macartney and Staunton, Staunton on the right and Macartney on the left. So Staunton, in his account, describes how, after crossing the Great Wall, one of the Tartar attendants of the embassy was about to be punished by some Chinese mandarins for stealing. Rather than submit to his punishment, however, the Tartar servant resisted with much vehemence, loudly exclaiming that no Chinese had the right of exercising authority over him on the Tartar side of the Great Wall. This seems to contradict Anderson's account. Staunton's narration of this incident suggests that the Great Wall has not lost all its importance as a boundary marker between Tartary and China. If we turn to Macartney's own journal, we find an even greater importance imbued to this incident. For Macartney records how, after the Tartar servant had been subdued and was being punished, the embassy's ethnically Chinese literati companion, Wang Wenxiong, disparagingly commented to Macartney that, quote, "a Tartar will always be a Tartar." The conclusion which Macartney draws from this is that far from simply being one nation, as Anderson would have it, there is still, in fact, a deep enmity between the two peoples. This episode, according to Macartney, strongly marks the jealousy that subsists between the Chinese and the Tartars. So I take the differences in perception of the Manchu-Chinese relationships between Anderson's account and those of Staunton and Macartney as emblematic of two broader approaches that 18th century Britons took to understanding Qing China and the legacy of the Manchu conquest. The first, that of Anderson, was a long-standing tradition which viewed the Qing dynasty as establishing ethnic harmony between Tartars and Chinese, whether via the complete Sinicization of the Tartars or by a more mutual process of acculturation. This vision of the Qing in European sources can be traced back to the immediate aftermath of the Manchu conquest, most famously in Martino Martini's widely popular De Bello Tartarico Historia of 1654. The second approach, in contrast, emphasized the continued hostility of the two peoples. Instead of ethnic harmony under the Qing, Macartney read the event at the crossing of the Great Wall as showing that there was a powerful streak of ethnic tension and even hatred which ran between the Qing's Chinese and Tartar subjects. So in this paper, I aim to show that British perceptions of ethnic divisions between Chinese and Manchus were consistently invoked as an interpretive framework for understanding the Qing regime and formulating British responses to it. Drawing on accounts from British diplomats, statesmen, and soldiers involved with Sino-British diplomacy during the Macartney embassy, including those of George Staunton, which we've already seen, the Napier incident of 1834, and then finally looking at an account of the First Opium War, I will hope to convince you that perceptions of Manchu and Chinese ethnic difference played a key role in how the British interpreted their contact with the Qing, increasingly being invoked as a justification for military intervention. This is in opposition to established understandings of how British perceptions of China grew increasingly hostile in the late 18th century, what is sometimes called the rise of Sinophobia, leading inevitably towards the imperialism of the 19th century. In the words of James Hevier, in his influential 1995 account of the Macartney embassy, late 18th century British disparagement of China, i.e. Sinophobia, was apparently so overwhelming that, quote, China was destroyed in writing well before a single British gun was leveled at a Chinese person. In this paper, however, I want to challenge this narrative. And I want to argue, in fact, that there was significant and actually a significant amount of British sympathy for the Chinese, whom some Britons believed were a civilized people, similar to the British in their appetite for arts, sciences, and most importantly, of course, for commerce. So instead of seeing this as a result of growing British hostility towards China, I want to instead argue that often growing British hostility was directed at the Qing government, explicitly construed as being driven by ethnic Manchu interests. This, of course, builds on the insights of the New Qing History School, which has demonstrated the central importance of ethnic differences under China's last dynasty. This paper simply argues that Britons picked up on some of these ethnic differences and interpreted them according to their own interests, believing or wanting to believe that the Manchus were supposedly hostile to trade and progress as a result of their, again, supposedly barbaric Tatar roots and their fearful need to suppress their more civilized and increasingly discontented Chinese subjects. British diplomats came to see the Manchus as the greatest block to British interests in China. They hoped that the fall of the Qing might enable the rise of a native Chinese regime, which, freed from the repressive shackles of the Manchus and grateful for British aid in their liberation, would open up China to Western trade and progress. So I'll spend most of my time talking about the Macartney Embassy itself. So as background, I should just say that Europeans had been commenting upon the ethnic differences within the Qing regime ever since the Manchu conquest in the mid-17th century. Now, although the Qing regime was mostly thought to have established relative ethnic harmony, the two peoples were nevertheless construed as having significantly different foundational ethnic identities. The Chinese, on the one hand, were universally acknowledged, even by their detractors, to be culturally sophisticated and materially wealthy. The Tatars, in contrast, were thought to be a simple nomadic people whose lives were dominated by warfare rather than the refined luxuries of the Chinese. These ethnic characteristics were open to both praise and criticism. Some praised the Manchus as examples of martial prowess and virtuous frugality, whilst others criticized their barbarity and supposed propensity for violence and bloodshed. On the other hand, some praised the Chinese for their wealth, culture, and long history, whilst others dismissed them as effeminate and overly attached to tradition. These ethnic differences between the Chinese and Manchus were a central preoccupation of Macartney and Staunton throughout their trip to China. In his journal, Macartney decisively declares that, quote, "It should never be absent from our recollection that there are now two distinct nations in China, the Chinese and the Tatars, whose characters essentially differ." So I think the word essentially is very important here. These are not trivial differences, but foundational ones, written into the very essence of the Chinese and Manchu characters, at least according to Macartney. These supposedly essential differences are construed as those between a barbarous and a civilized nations. According to Staunton, the Chinese still, quote, "consider the Tatars in general in the light of barbarians, and nothing since the Qing conquest has been able to overcome the opposition approaching to antipathy which must have previously subsisted between a warlike people ever endeavoring to invade and a civilized people always struggling to exclude." So these observations of fundamental ethnic difference led Macartney and Staunton to believe that the Tatar rule of China was alien, despotic, and unjust. For Staunton, the Qing regime is characterized by a, quote, "partiality in all differences between Tatars and Chinese, in which the balance of justice has been tilted towards the Tatars, as is always to be expected in relations between the conquerors and the conquered." Macartney even more openly declared Qing China a foreign tyranny. He argued that the, quote, "ancient constitution of China had been a government by law, but that under the Qing, it had been transformed into the tyranny of a handful of Tatars over more than 300 millions of Chinese." Following on from this, Macartney and Staunton both detected elements of rebelliousness amongst the Chinese towards their supposedly tyrannical Tatar rulers. Staunton notes that it is, quote, "a common saying in China that no half a dozen natives, i.e. Chinese, are assembled for an hour before they begin to clamor against the Tatars." On the basis of this, Staunton predicts that the Qing dynasty will not last much longer, since it has already lasted almost as long as the average length of preceding dynasties. Staunton believes that the Tatars themselves are aware of this and consequently feel insecure in their position as rulers. He claims that the, quote, "mistrust of the embassy on the part of almost every Tatar chief is because they are concerned about the spreading of the new French principles," i.e. the spread of the French Revolution, to China, instigating a revolution against Tatar rule. Macartney himself draws this potential parallel with the French Revolution. He states that the Chinese are now awakening from their political stupor they had been thrown into by the Tatars. But he also warns that if the Chinese are, quote, "not led to emancipation by degrees, but let loose on a burst of enthusiasm, they would probably fall into all the excesses of folly and be found as unfit for the enjoyment of freedom as the French and the Negroes." Although Macartney unsurprisingly disavows the French and Haitian revolutions here, The fact that he compares the situation in China to them demonstrates his belief that Tatar rule has created the potential for a similarly revolutionary liberation movement amongst the Chinese. Indeed, like Staunton, Macartney cast significant doubt upon the dynasty's long-term future, saying, "I am very much mistaken if all the authority and all the address of the Tatar government will be able to much longer stifle the energies of their Chinese subjects. Scarcely a year now passes without an insurrection in one of the provinces." Should such a revolution occur, the overthrow of the Tatar government would seem to be in the best interest of the British state. Macartney and Staunton both make it clear throughout their accounts of their embassy that the chief opposition to their goals, particularly of expanding trade, was a result of the Tatar government and not the Chinese people. Indeed, the Chinese people themselves are portrayed as interested in commerce, as well as artistic and scientific advancement. Macartney praises the common people of China, who he describes as a strong, hardy race, patient, industrious, and much given to traffic and all the arts of gain. Their industrious work ethic and love of the arts of gain would seem to make the Chinese hospitable for commerce and receiving the English embassy. This is confirmed by Staunton, who claims that the restrictions on trade in Canton were not a customary Chinese tradition, but had been imposed since the Tatar conquest. Current opposition in the court towards commerce is said to be the result of the hostility to trade of several statesmen of China, especially the Tatars, who are concerned by the potential for disturbance occasioned by the admission of foreign trade. Again, another sign of possible Chinese rebelliousness. Moreover, for Macartney, China's supposed lack of artistic and scientific progress also results from Tatar rule. He acknowledges that the Kangxi Emperor had previously patronized science, but states that this had now been entirely forgotten by the policy of the present government, which is instead to discourage all novelties out of fear that this would stir up discontent. However, Macartney also believes that whilst the Tatar government may now be hostile to scientific progress, the Chinese people themselves are still fascinated by European innovation. He describes how the embassy's leading scientist, James Dinwiddie, gave lectures in Canton, which, quote, highly delighted the local Chinese merchants there, which was in stark contrast to the stony disinterest that Dinwiddie's attempts to show off scientific progress had met with at the Qing court. Macartney also tells an anecdote about a Chinese merchant in Canton who wanted to build a ship on the English model, which of course in Macartney's eyes is a sure sign of innovation and progress, but was punished for, quote, departing from the ancient established modes of the empire. This is a consequence of the Tatar government, which betrays the conscious fear and jealousy that the Tatars entertain of their subjects' taste for novelty. So just to quickly sum up on the Macartney embassy, I think by looking at this ethnic dynamic, or how Macartney and Staunton understood the ethnic dynamics of the Qing Empire, we can come to a rather surprising conclusion. Far from being late 18th century Sinophobes, their attitudes towards the Chinese themselves were actually relatively positive, viewing the Chinese as civilized people very similar to the British, who were interested in science, progress, and commerce. Their attitudes towards China's government, however, were much more hostile. With a supposedly barbaric Tatar heritage and fearful of rebellion by their oppressed Chinese subjects, the Qing government was thought to be the main blockage to British interests, as well as the interests of the Chinese people. Now, although Macartney explicitly disavowed the use of violence in pursuing British interests in China, this framework of thinking about the relationship between the Manchus and Chinese could clearly lend itself to a military pursuit of British interests presented in terms of liberating the Chinese from oppressive Tatar rule. And as we shall see, this was indeed the kind of language which was used by the British in the build-up to and during the First Opium War. And I was just going to quickly try and explain why I think Anderson's account is different, but I think because of time, I better just move straight on to the military stuff. So maybe if anyone's interested, they can ask me in the Q&A. Okay, so we will start with the Napier incident. Now, the Napier incident, a bit of background on this because it's not necessarily that famous. So the Napier incident happened in 1834. Lord Napier was the first appointed chief superintendent of British trade in China, appointed by the British government after the ending of the East India Company's monopoly of trade with the Far East in 1833. Upon arrival in Canton, Napier's intransigence immediately led him into conflict with the local Canton authorities, and he very prematurely died from typhus after being expelled to Macau in October 1834. Now, this is a really sort of minor event in many ways, but it's very interesting because Napier is one of the first senior British statesmen to raise the possibility of military intervention in China. And if we look at his letters to Viscount Palmerston, who was the Foreign Secretary during the First Opium War, the outbreak of the First Opium War, we can see how a vision of Manchu and Chinese hostility was central to Napier's understanding of the Qing and his encouragement of military intervention. So Napier, just like Macartney, believed that the Chinese themselves were a commercial people who would be happy to trade with Britain, writing of how every Chinaman is constantly at work, nobody seen loitering about an idle, and in fact, every man is a merchant. This Chinese enthusiasm for trade, however, in Napier's eyes, however, is alien to the Tartar government. In a later letter to Prime Minister Earl Grey, Napier states that although the Chinese people are most anxious for our trade, it is the Tartar government alone which is anti-commercial. In his opinion, this resulted in there being not the slightest fellowship between the Chinese and the Tartars. However, despite the fact that all the Chinese do not like the Tartars, he nonetheless says that they cannot help themselves on account of Chinese military weakness. So Napier thus advocated for taking a strong line against the Qing government if they refuse to open up trade further, urging that the British should remind the emperor, quote, that he is only an intruder and that it will be his good policy to secure himself upon his throne by gratifying the wishes of his people, i.e. by granting more commercial privileges to the British, enabling the wishes of the Chinese for trade. This essentially amounts basically to a military threat, warning the Tartar emperor that refusing to trade with Britain would go against the wishes of the his Chinese subjects and could result in them rebelling with possible support from the British. Lord Napier's letters thus mark the first time when British understandings of Tartar and Chinese differences and mutual hostility were used to advocate for, at the very least, a suggestion of military force. However, Napier's premature death meant that his warmongering was cut short, and there seems to be relatively little willingness on the part of the British state to undertake any military action at this time. But nonetheless, Napier's conjunction of imperialist militarism with the discourse of Chinese and Tartar relations would set an important precedent. By the time of the First Opium War itself, this conjunction had clearly taken hold of some soldiers on the ground. So I'm going to mention just one of these accounts from the early stages of the First Opium War, published in 1841 by Lord Jocelyn, the military secretary to the British General Lord Saltoun. So Lord Jocelyn states that the restrictions on commercial enterprise in China, which he believes to be the fundamental reason for the war, are, quote, a result of its present Tartar rulers who are jealous of any influence that foreigners may gain over the people, and thus try to keep their subjects as blind as possible to the movements and feelings of all foreign nations. Just like Macartney, he blamed the lack of innovation in Chinese society on this Tartar jealousy, stating that Chinese lack of progress is caused not by a deficiency of talent or energy, but from the systematic darkness inculcated by their rulers. Lord Jocelyn emphasized this hostility, which had emphasized the hostility which this had created between Tartars and Chinese, writing that although so long as the military power rests in the hands of the Tartars, the present rulers may hold sway over the people, nonetheless, should disaster and misery come down upon the Qing, the downfall of the present weak government must be the consequence. He then listed several examples of recent Chinese resistance to the government as evidence of this. Interestingly, the belief in Chinese hostility towards the Tartars held by British soldiers seems to have even influenced the thinking of military commanders in their approach to the war, with Jocelyn writing that because it was rumored that the people of Fujian and Zhejiang were hostile to their Tartar rulers, British military command made cultivating their friendship a priority so as to secure supplies and potential military bases. Upon landing in Zhoushan, Jocelyn reports that the British read out a proclamation to the people there, stating that they intended no harm to them, but only quarreled with their Tartar government. There were, however, limits to how far this narrative could be taken. For although there were signs of Chinese discontent with Manchu rule during the First Opium War, there was no major anti-Manchu uprising supporting the British, and indeed many Chinese, of course, fought strenuously against them. Lord Jocelyn noted this phenomenon with disappointment. He reported how, far from being inspired by the British to rebel against their Tartar rulers and support the British invasion, the anti-Qing proclamation read out at Zhoushan instead produced deep groans amongst the Chinese people who heard it. Indeed, the clenched hands and anxious faces of the Chinese seemed rather to suggest to Jocelyn How false was the idea that we were come amongst a people who only waited for the standard of the foreigner to throw off a detested and tyrant yoke. Shaken by this reaction of the hostile multitude of Chinese to British claims to be liberating them, Jocelyn assumed that the Chinese must hate the invading barbarians, i.e. the British, more bitterly than their Tatar rulers. He concluded that the idea of fundamental hatred and dislike of the natives in China for their Tatar rulers was only a fiction. The resistance shown by the Chinese to British imperialism thus seems to have actually given some British writers on the ground in China room for pause in their assessment of the relationship between Qing ethnic tensions and British diplomatic and military intervention. However, although Jocelyn had voiced doubts about the established understanding of Chinese and Tatar hostility, his seems to have been pretty much a lone voice. Instead, in the immediate aftermath of the Opium War, Qing China's ethnic situation continued to act as a justification for the conflict. The Liverpool Mercury, a weekly Liverpudlian newspaper covering local, national, and international news, published several articles towards the end of 1842, after the conclusion of the First Opium War, on the state of Britain's relationship with China. Drawing openly on the writings of the elder George Staunton, one article from the 28th of October 1842 reproduced the established argument that, quote, the Chinese people are especially devoted to foreign commerce, but that they are constrained by the selfish anti-commercial spirit of their Tatar government. According to the Liverpool Mercury, this has resulted in a situation where the Chinese people are entirely opposed to their government in respect to trade and immigration, but the current restrictions on trade are but the narrow policy of the Tatar dynasty, who are ever in a state of alarm at the increasing intelligence, wealth, and power of the people. The article concludes with the hope that the Opium War may lead to a revolution in Qing trade policy, which will benefit Britain whilst also liberating the ingrained commercial sensibility of the Chinese themselves. A later article from December the 9th, 1842, makes similar points. Whilst it professes a regret over the loss of life sustained during the Opium War, it nonetheless concludes that the, quote, consequences of this short war will be extremely beneficial to the Chinese themselves and no less to our own country through the liberation of Chinese commercial instincts. I think most importantly, the fact that the Liverpool Mercury had previously published anti-opium speeches, such as that given by Robert R.R. Moore in 1840, which fully condemned the First Opium War, shows how widespread and convincing this narrative of Tatar oppression of the Chinese was, perhaps especially to those Britons who were skeptical of other less humanitarian or supposedly humanitarian justifications for the war. So just to very quickly sum up and conclude, the importance of British understandings of Manchu-Chinese relations to justifying their military aggression demonstrates that mere hostility towards China was not the only mode of legitimizing the First Opium War. In opposition to established scholarly assumptions, which view late 18th century Sinophobia as discrediting China in European eyes, and thus paving the way for 19th century imperialism, I hope that this paper has shown that many diplomats, statesmen, and soldiers in China, from the Macartney Embassy onwards, instead often held favorable attitudes towards the Chinese, believing them to be a civilized people interested in progress, science, and most importantly, of course, commerce. Instead, hostility was increasingly directed towards the Manchus, who were defined in opposition to the Chinese, whom they were thought to be oppressing. Starting with Lord Napier, this narrative of Manchu oppression of their Chinese subjects and obstructiveness to Western progress was increasingly invoked as a justification for British military intervention, including during and immediately after the First Opium War itself. Although it should be clarified that this legitimizing narrative operated alongside other justifications, including ones which of course promoted a very hostile view of China, the consistency with which the narrative of Tatar tyranny was invoked by Britons between the Macartney Embassy and the First Opium War suggests it was an important and widely promulgated interpretive framework for understanding the Qing that should not be overlooked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Moncrief from All Souls College at Oxford there. Now, I'd like to give floor over to the digital floor, I should say, over to Dr. William Poole of New College, Oxford, who will be speaking to us on the theme of priorities and problems in early English sinology. Dr. Poole.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear and see me? away from Hong Kong. Excellent, good. Well, I speak to you from the tiny village of Garsington, just south of Oxford, where there is frost on the ground. And I shall whip through my talk in quick time, I hope. I'm going to share my screen, give you a PowerPoint, and then I will start. Okay, is that good? Can everyone see? Right. I aim to give a whistle-stop tour of priorities and problems in early English sinology. And by priorities, I mean areas of interest available to English observers. And by problems, I mean potential constraints on English interests imposed not only by the kinds of evidence available, but by the disciplinary structure of the English academe. My period, however, is the one before the one that we've just heard about from Ross, and I'm going to talk about roughly the 17th century. Broadly speaking, most Western learned observers of Eastern matters, as opposed to missionaries or traders, tended to focus their interests around the categories of travel writing and maps, that is to say geography, political science, that is to say the organization of foreign powers, history and chronology, particularly the claims of the Chinese to extreme antiquity, theology and moral philosophy, the belief systems of the Chinese, medicine and the related areas of botany and zoology, and finally language study itself, also extending to matters of notation, arithmetic, and metrology. Elizabethan interest in China was spurred on by translation of accounts of the Far East, usually written in the languages, so the English would think, of European enemies, that is to say the Spanish and the Portuguese. And the landmark here, of course, is Mendoza's History of China, which made it into English in the year of the Spanish Armada. A decade later, Hakluyt could include a 1590 Macau Latin dialogue on China in his principal navigations, and Elizabeth I famously tried to contact the Emperor of China by letters. One sent in 1602 arrived in 1984. Gradually, this new geographical knowledge seeped into literature. Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, for instance, 1621, contains several references to the Mandarin culture of China, a prospect of a learning ruling caste that was to prove rather attractive to Western imaginations. Perhaps the most fun incursion into literature, however, was the use of accounts in Hakluyt and Samuel Purchas by the Bishop of Hereford, Francis Godwin, whose Man in the Moon, posthumously published in 1638, features a tiny Spaniard who flies to the moon by means of geese, as you can see in the picture, but crash lands in China on his return journey, where he meets identifiable members of the Jesuit mission. Discussion of China in geographical collections impacted upon political science because geographical textbooks were often structured as world tours with prose descriptions of each region. Perhaps the most important of these in English was the Oxford Don Peter Heylyn's Microcosmos, first published in 1621, a work that retained a market for a century in its various ever-growing editions. These editions are especially important because they display and track a problem that Ross has discussed, namely that the West had inherited accounts of regions that were called Cathay, China, and Tartary. And although somewhat arbitrary boundaries were placed between these three realms, in truth, no one was really that sure. And by the mid-17th century, following the publications of Martino Martini, Cathay began to disappear, and realization grew that modern Tartary was really a collection of various powers, no longer under any great Khan as a leader, and that one branch of them indeed, following 1644, had taken over China. And Martini is, of course, the key figure here, and compliments here to Ross on his fantastic catalogue. This is something that features in it, Martini's Atlas of 1655. And his histories of 1658 as well equipped European readers for the first time with tools that looked like primary texts drawn from narrative sources. This is somewhat complicated, of course, by the Jesuit theological overlay on Chinese history, something to which we will return, as well as the stark problem that Martini's king lists placed Chinese origins before the Noachic flood, a problem that could only be solved by redating the flood, usually via adoption of the Greek text of the Old Testament, or by denying the credibility of Chinese historiography entirely. For those such as Isaac Vossius or Robert Carey, who were already inclined to prefer the Greek text of the Old Testament, the Chinese account was valuable ammunition. here is some of Martini there, this famous picture on the origins of Chinese characters. In fact, as the late Knud Lundbach worked out, itself derived from a popular Chinese encyclopedia. The interest in astronomy that was also visible throughout Martini's Chinese history also provided food for thought. And if we turn, for instance, to Edward Sherburne's 1675 Catalogue of Astronomers, we start to find Chinese names, obviously culled from Martino Martini. Here we are, a list here of early astronomers, all evidently Chinese. Chronology, indeed, was heavily influenced by the Chinese problem. This is exemplified, of course, by the publication in Paris in 1687 of the landmark Confucius Sinarum Philosophus. This carefully steered and packaged production featured not just Latin translations of three of the classics, but an important preface and Philip Couplet's appended chronological tables, again based on Martini. Now, when the work was reviewed in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions, its Confucian core was all but ignored. What interested the experimental philosophers of London was the chronology, and chief among them was Robert Hooke, to whom I will return. What about the reception of Confucius and Confucian philosophy itself? Now, Confucius as a name had been known to English readers since at least Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, which in its second major edition of 1599 to 1600 had included, I earlier mentioned, a 1590 dialogue on China, where Confucian doctrine is admired, but also faulted as insufficiently theistic. Following the publication of Martini's history of 1658, the enforced Christianization of Confucius became an option, as the architect and extreme Sinophile John Webb, a Protestant, nevertheless happy to repeat one of the more risky Jesuit claims, asserted in 1661, Confucius not only taught the incarnation of Jesus Christ, but knew in what year of the Chinic cycle it should come to pass, thereby rendering Kongzi a Christian prophet. This Webb, for instance, is the same one who claimed that Adam and Eve spoke classical Chinese in the Garden of Eden. In the Restoration, Confucius made his proper appearance as a moral philosopher. In the appendix to a sermon preached at court in 1674, the preacher, the FRS Nathaniel Vincent, published this only just a decade later, and his source for extracts from the Da Xue was eventually the rare Jianchang Jesuit parallel Chinese Latin Sapienta Sinica of 1662. His very copy is still in the British Library. He also intimated, very interestingly, that some fellows of the Royal Society, possibly I think Robert Hooke, who I mentioned, and his friend Francis Lodwick, an inventor of artificial languages, planned an edition of Confucius. But detailed reception of Confucian moral philosophy had to await the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus of 1687. Almost at once, however, the text became hijacked for the emergent ancients versus moderns disputes of the 1690s. Sir William Temple, for instance, praising Chinese cultural achievement in 1690, as Isaac Vossius, without quite these resources, had notoriously done 5 years previously. Temple was then answered by William Wootton, one of the moderns, who returned the judgment on the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus that it was, I quote, merely an incoherent rhapsody of moral sayings. A further portion became available in 1693 in a translation via French of extracts from 3 of the 4 books, followed by 80 Confucian maxims, the source again being the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus. I've mentioned Hooke, and one other area in which, at a translated distance of at least 2 languages as ever, Chinese influence was starting to be felt, is medicine. I don't have time to broaden this into the parallel avenues of botany and zoology, especially if there might be therapeutic application, but you listening to this will know what I mean, and the dispersal of the Polish Jesuit Michael Boehm's work is central, even if most of it came through Athanasius Kircher, rightly regarded as a self-licensing charlatan by most intelligent and all Protestant observers. For medicine, the 2 areas that interested Western readers were the emphasis on pulse medicine, something celebrated by Isaac Vossius, and moxibustion. Now, the former was harder to demonstrate, but the latter potentially was not, and the most sensational example I have for you is Robert Hooke demonstrating moxibustion before the Royal Society. An English translation of a dialogue by a Dutch VOC physician on the cure of gout through moxibustion was published in 1676 by Moses Pitt a printer with very close links to the Royal Society, where the Chinese origins of the practice were attested. Pitt even stocked moxa in his bookshop, sold with a paper on how to burn it properly. So Hooke did exactly that, demonstrating this before the Royal Society. His interest continued. In 1685, he read a paper on the Chinese abacus, and he followed this with a paper both published in the Philosophical Transactions the following year, with conjectures on the nature and origins of Chinese script, a fascinating performance in which he proposed that the written, as opposed to the spoken language, provided an example of an artificial philosophical language constructed by design in remote antiquities by a class of sage Chinese philosophers. I'm going to conclude by talking about my favorite encounter in this period. For what was really lacking in all of this was talking to actual Chinese people. Now that was almost impossible in the West in the period, but now and then occasions arose. The most important, without any doubt, was the visit of Shen Fuzong to the West in the 1680s. Shen was the son of Christian converts, and he traveled to the West as part of Coupelet's mission, he who masterminded the Confucius Sinarum Philosophers as appendix on chronology. And here is the very famous portrait of Shen, sorry, the quality is poor, by Sir Godfrey Kneller, painted at the command of the King of England, James II, who hung it in his bedroom. Shen had an interesting opportunity to visit England in the summer and autumn of 1687, where he collaborated with the librarian of the Bodleian, Thomas Hyde, already an enthusiastic Orientalist. This, to me, is the crucial moment of not only early English, but early Western sinology. And this is because Shen and Hyde could talk and write together, the language of their interaction being Latin, but with Shen writing Chinese characters, vocalizing them in Latin script, and then Hyde responding to Shen's spoken voice, translating into Latin. This level of personal interlinguistic dialogue may have happened in other encounters in the period, but if so, surely only a very few, and none left such a documentary record as this, because Hyde and Shen's working papers survive in a box in the British Library. Shen sat with Hyde in the summer of 1687 in the Bodleian Library, answered questions on Chinese numbers, language, religion, calendars, games, weights, measures, and he helped Hyde catalogue the library's otherwise utterly mysterious stock of books in Chinese script. One of the most spectacular engagements was with the now world-famous Selden map, as Shen helped Hyde with the geography near and beyond the Great Wall, a particular European interest at this time, for obvious reasons, as we've heard. Here is a detail from the portrait that Hyde had of himself when he demitted as librarian, and we can notice that he chooses to have himself painted holding a scroll not of Arabic or Hebrew, which were the professorships he held, but of Chinese. And his painter has almost got a couple of characters right. Gua at the top, antiquity, Li, the Chinese mile just below it, some other indistinct ones. This is fascinating. Not least because Hyde himself had an interest in some of the concepts associated with these characters. If you look very carefully at the map of Selden map of China, you can still see Hyde and Shen's handwriting as they drew directly onto what is now one of the most valuable maps in the world, not something you'd be allowed to do today. Hyde also recopied a section of it into his own papers, and here it is. Here is the regions around the wall, and you can obviously see Shen writing down characters, and then in Latin script, trying to vocalize them below, and then Hyde in his tiny little handwriting, writing Latin glosses next to him. This is remarkable. This is the working papers of two men, a Chinaman and an Englishman, trying to understand a late Ming map on the table in the Bodleian in the summer of 1687. Hyde published work arising from these encounters, and these texts in their small ways announced the arrival of something we might properly call sinology. First came Hyde's essay on Chinese weights and measures. Here I give a plug for an edition I did of this. Every household needs two. He also published this with comments on tea, on maps, on Chinese New Year. Then came his extraordinary book on Oriental board games, in which he explains that he sat down and played Xiangqi with Shen in the library. He illustrated the game, explained its rules, and you can just about work out how to play it from Hyde's Latin account. Finally, in 1700, Hyde published his masterwork on Persian religion, in which he took occasion to provide a long digression, again with illustrations on the Chinese calendrical cycle, again engraved illustrations directly from Shen's papers. Hyde had planned a whole book on Chinese matters, gathering together all the material from his papers generated with Shen, and all that stopped it was cost. Hyde fished for a patron. In this case, he pursued the chemist and natural philosopher Robert Boyle, but funds were unforthcoming. It's a shame. That book would have changed the history of the discipline. After Shen left, the two men corresponded. Hyde's side is lost, but Shen's replies survive. Here is one, explaining characters not coincidentally appearing in Shang-Chi, of course. And in many cases, we can see material from the letters directly transposed into Hyde's printed works. A few tiny conclusions. First, English and indeed Western interest in all matters Chinese was of course controlled by the disciplinary interests available to Western scholars, and it's particularly in the genres of geography, history, philosophy, medicine that we see Chinese interests expressed and explored. China studies, as it were, had no independent existence and would not do so for over 2 centuries. Hyde's missing unfunded book might have changed that, but probably not. We should probably not call this proto-sinology either. I find it a faintly patronizing term, as if there were some moment when the discipline woke up, as it were. The interests we see in this period were perfectly coherent, if often not very well informed, and they reflect, as all our interests will do, the academic and increasingly scientific cultures of learning among the Western natures. But we all like moments when something seems to have changed. And if I were to leave you with one, then surely it must be Oxford in the summer of 1687, when Thomas Hyde and Shen Fuzong sat down in the Bodleian Library and started to play Chinese chess. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Poole for that talk. Now, next we have Professor Eugenio Menegon from Boston University, who, as I said earlier, unfortunately can't be with us in person today, but I understand that we have a recorded presentation to show to you all. So I'm sure that will be coming up just a moment. And I should tell you, the title of his talk is going to be Cannons and Artillery, the Ming-Qing War Seen Through Scholl's Essentials of Gunnery and Martini's Tartar War.
Greeting from Boston. I'm Eugenio Menegon from Boston University, and I would like to thank Professor Stuart McManus from the History Department and Ms. Catherine Chu, Special Collections Librarian, both at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, for inviting me today and literally bringing together China and the West through this symposium. Greetings to all the colleagues presenting today and the public following us in person and remotely. Let me now share my PowerPoint presentation. The title of my presentation today is Cannons and Artillery, the Ming-Qing War Seen Through Scholl's Essential of Gunnery and Martini's Tartar War. Inspired by the book exhibition organized by the library and the catalog compiled by Professor McManus, I've chosen to concentrate on 2 rare books, one in Chinese and one in English, included in the catalog. The books are authored by Jesuit missionaries who lived during the Ming-Qing transition in China, who found themselves swept by the political winds of those heady times and forced to choose what regime to serve according to historical circumstances. I'm talking of the German Adam Schalfon Bell, who resided in Beijing as an astronomer, and the Italian Martino Martini, who traveled across central and southern China, mainly residing in Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Fujian, and who was asked to use his Western knowledge to help the Southern Ming resistance to the Manchus. Schall and Martini spent a brief period together in Beijing in 1650 after the Manchu conquest and the initial pacification of the empire, and were supposed to collaborate at the astronomical office. But two willful personalities like theirs were not meant to coexist easily. Soon, the superiors decided to send Martini back to Europe as procurator of the China mission. Here you have a map of China from the 1680s showing the main cities and the Jesuit residences. The two books I have chosen are a treatise on canon making by Shao and a description of the so-called Tartar War, that is the Manchu conquest of China by Martini. During the late Ming period, Shao resided in the capital, where besides working on astronomical reform, he was also forced by the pressure of Chinese literati converts and the Ming government to instruct local artisans in the production of artillery to defend the borders from the Manchu threat. In 1643, a year before the fall of Beijing to the Manchus, he dictated to a collaborator, the scholar Jiao Xu, the text of a practical manual for the casting of cannon. The copy preserved at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Library is a reprint dated 1847, like the one I'm showing here that I found online. At least two early Qing Dynasty manuscript copies exist in China. One copy is in the Library of the Forbidden City. And then we have two printed editions, one dated 1841 and the one printed in 1847 in the exhibition, plus later editions. It is, of course, not casual that the book was reprinted twice in the 1840s, at least twice. The shock of the Qing defeat in the First Opium War in 1840-42 made urgent again for China to learn how to cast cannon. This 2 centuries-old treatise, by then almost forgotten, and certainly obsolete if compared to 19th century military technology from the West, was rescued from oblivion, perhaps to help the Qing military or even local gentry militias revive its artillery production. European artillery technology was introduced in China starting in the early 1600s, but became a matter of great urgency when internal peasant rebellions combined with the Manchu pressure from the north started seriously threatening the ruling Ming dynasty. Gunpowder reached Europe from China thanks to the Mongols. There, endless warfare between the European states stimulated a more advanced artillery technology than in China. The key Western invention was the so-called breech loading method from the back of the cannon, breech indicating the posterior of the weapon. Rather than waste a lot of time ramming the charge and the projectile down the muzzle, it was much more convenient to have a separate container for all these, shaped rather like a beer mug with a handle, and placed in position in a cavity arranged to receive it at the breech of the cannon, that is, in its posterior part. This replaceable cylinder was known as the chamber or culasse. In the 1510s, Western-style cannon of the breech loader type, probably of Portuguese origin, appeared in China and were named Wolanji, that is, engines or machine of the Franks, as Europeans were known in the Muslim and Malay world. By the early 1600s, even the terminology for cannon in Chinese military texts reflected Western usage. Illustrations, too, often showed clear influence from the West. For example, the field gun called the Tiger Cat mortar was illustrated in the act of bombarding a city, which with its church towers and crenellated walls seemed likely to have come out of some Western gunnery book. Europeans were not only more advanced than the Chinese in making cannon, but also able to transform mathematical and physical knowledge of ballistics into mechanical calculating devices that gunners could use to estimate the appropriate amount of gunpowder and the angle of elevation to be used for balls of different materials and targets at various ranges. This method of transforming mathematical knowledge into calculating devices contrasted to the experiential method used by the Chinese at the time. However, while Western cannon was relatively lighter and more mobile, China still retained the edge in the technology of gunpowder, as distinct from that of weapon construction. In the early 16th century, European traders brought their armaments and their casting techniques to China by way of Japan, India, and Southeast Asia. Initially, in the 1620s, Portuguese cannon were imported from Macau. The Christian high official Li Zhizao and Xu Guangqi were in charge of drilling troops, and probably also Yang Tingyun facilitated the importation of several cannon cast in a foundry in Macau and accompanied by Portuguese gunners. The cannon were successfully used against the Manchus during a famous siege in northeast China in 1626, and were then employed on other occasions, proving the superiority of Western models over earlier Chinese ones. Subsequently, Ming imperial authorities asked the Jesuit missionary to cast new cannon and produce theoretical writings on ballistic, an interest that continued into the Qing period until the end of the 18th century. The direct involvement of Jesuits in cannon casting began precisely with Charles, who in 1636 or 1642, according to other sources, was ordered to cast 20 cannon over 2 years. He was tasked with the production of small siege guns, which would be easier to use and transport than heavy artillery. A second imperial order to cast an additional set of 500 smaller cannon was never carried out because of the difficult situation in the capital at the time. Charles' treatise on Western gunnery was written under these trying circumstances, in all likelihood at the suggestion of Jiao Xu. This was not, however, the first book in Chinese on the subject. The Christian converts Michael Zhangdao, who went twice to Macau to procure cannon, and Paul Xun Xueshi wrote together the first such book in 1623 entitled Illustrated Explanation of Western Gunnery, 西洋火攻图说, a short treatise which has apparently been lost. The Christian military official Ignatius Sun Yuanhua trained crack troops with Western arms in Shandong and compiled around 1623 a book on firearms entitled Exceptional Technology According to the Western Methods, 西法升级. These texts were picked up by other military experts who republished them in some form within their collections between 1626 and 1630. Charles' treatise, dated 1643, was the first book on cannon by a Western missionary, entitled Essentials of Gunnery, 火攻级要, but also 自口录. It was dictated by Charles to Jiao, probably on the basis of works in European languages available in the Jesuit library, and on practical experience. Jiao Xu began his introduction to the essentials on gunnery by praising the artillery traditions of China, but also recognizing that times had changed. Chinese gunnery is indeed complete. Our books on the subject are so detailed that it long seemed as if later generations could not add a single word to them. But times change and situations differ. And today it is difficult to say the same things we used to say in the past. Those who are deeply concerned about our present predicament cannot help but examine these changes and set about to find the right cure for our disease, so to speak. Jiao Xu listed then the shortcomings of Chinese literature on military affairs, citing them as the reason to publish the Essentials on Gunnery. Ancient and modern Chinese books on warfare He wrote, and here I quote, may be called fairly comprehensive, but some do not take into account the differences between North and South, or naval and land warfare. Others may have been useful in the past, but have no benefit for us today. And still others are full of trite and superfluous things and have no practical use at all. Thus, it seems that none of them is of any value in our present emergency. He also criticized Chinese books on armory and fire lances, since, he said, they seek only strange and wondrous things, or are so sketchy and exaggerated that it is impossible to comprehend how they could ever have been printed. Jiao felt a duty to seek out these Western teachers and discover the secrets of more efficient guns to save the Ming dynasty. For the Jesuits, on the other hand, casting cannon was a suffered choice, but also a strategic one. In the 1680s, Claudio Filippo Grimaldi retrospectively looked back to the Ming-Qing transition and concluded that, quote, among the most effective human means that offered a firmer footing in China to the fathers of that era, one was astronomy, the other ballistics. And here we see other images from the same treatise with images of cannons and their use. This is a later 1851 re-edition with the title of Zikolu, Zhenbu Zikolu, so augmented Zikolu. In the mid-1640s, Martini himself was tapped by the southern Ming regime of the Lungwu Emperor in Zhejiang and Fujian for his ability, real or presumed, in ballistics and gun casting. Later on, Martini carefully concealed this fact in his published work in Europe. Once the Jesuits decided that the Manchus were the winners, they could no longer publicize their past support for the Ming. The Dominican friar and polemist Domingo Navarrete openly accused Martini of hiding the truth and his identity as a gunpowder mandarin, a mandarin de pólvora, for the Longwu regimes as follows. Martini refers to the circumstances of when he was captured by the Tartars in 1646, but very differently from how it happened. Father Martino was then traveling with Liu Junzao, military leader of the southern Ming Lungwu emperor's regime, as gunpowder mandarin, a title that his confreres considered detrimental. He almost avoided shaving his hair. He confessed to be very close to Father Adam Schall, and this is how he saved himself. In his description of the Tartar War, Martini noted the importance of artillery for both the Ming and Qing sides in several places, and witnessed its use in some of the fighting at a relatively close range. However, I want now to move away from war and guns and rather talk about the 1654 English edition of the Bellum Tartaricum, or the conquest of the great and most renowned empire of China by the invasion of the Tartars, as an item in the circulation of knowledge across cultures. As observed in the exhibition catalog, this edition was derived from the Latin edition published in Antwerp that same year. A small in-quarto booklet in both cases, this was thought as a pocketbook and became instantly a bestseller in 10 languages and multiple editions. Only 2 rough prints adorned this British edition. An imaginary portrait of Nurhaci, the first Manchu ruler, and a crude map of China and its provinces, copied from the original first edition of the Officina Plantiniana. The portrait of Nurhaci, as the caption underscores, is indeed a lively effigy of the Manchu ruler. It is rather fantastic and tries to capture the rough nature of the Manchus, even if the hat reveals a dainty European-style crown. Moreover, the caption inaccurately states that Teiningus, that is the Tianming Emperor, the era name of Nurhaci, is still reigning. In fact, Nurhaci had died already in 1626. As to the map, we should not assume that it is crude because of the English printer's lack of expertise. It is in fact a close copy of the contemporary original in the Antwerp edition, which does not carry any portrait of the Manchu ruler. The Dutch 1655 edition has instead several prints, but none resembling this portrait. As Martini explained in the original Latin edition, he had intentionally included only this schematic map based on an original from China to help his readers with the unfamiliar geographic names of that country, thus avoiding to spoil the editorial novelty of this forthcoming Novus Atlas Sinensis, a product of great cartographic sophistication and detail. Because there are frequently passages in this history in which are mentioned specific provinces and cities of the Chinese Empire, which are being attacked, defended, or devastated by various armies from north to south, east to west, or vice versa, to assist the benevolent reader so that he shouldn't stop, lost or hesitant, in front of names of lands poorly known in Europe, I've decided to put at the front a map in which one can follow the itineraries. It is certainly not an accurate one, but it has been drawn by a Chinese scholar so that it should serve its purpose. More accurate maps, general and particulars, with a precise description of provinces and individual cities and of things related to them, and with longitude and latitude, and the remaining information about astronomical, natural, and geographical history will be found in my Chinese atlas, so not to hamper with a premature display here the success of my larger work. And if you're interested, of course, you can also find in this article a comparison between the different editions in different languages. I turn now to the circulation of this book from 17th century England to the library of the Chinese University of Hong Kong today. How did this volume on the Tartar War reach the library? I do not have data on it, but perhaps our host will be able to clarify its provenance, maybe from an antiquarian sale receipt or a gift letter. I did not have access to any specific records from the library catalog or even a scan of the copy kept in Hong Kong. From what I could gather from other online copies, however, I can at least reflect on the place where the book was printed and sold in Europe. The cover of the book indicates that it was printed for John Crook and are to be sold at his shop at the sign of the Ship in St. Paul's Churchyard, London. St. Paul's Cathedral stood at the heart of London, and the neighborhood at its base hummed in the 16th and 17th century with life, becoming a place for debate and protest, knowledge and gossip. The area of Churchyard, in particular, was filled with printers and bookshops where Shakespeare came in search of inspiration and where a theater with boy actors staged plays by leading dramatists. After the Great Fire of 1666, the Churchyard became the center of the English literary world, its reconstructed bookshops nestling among establishments offering luxury goods. Our publisher and book dealer John Crook was based in this part of town, and between 1640 and the fire of 1666, he occupied the shop at the sign of the Ship. John had a thriving business also in Dublin, Ireland, where he later ran the King's Printing Office, and possibly his Catholic contacts there might have facilitated communication with the continent and the publication of Martini's work. The shop at the sign of the Ship was located on Paternoster Row and was rebuilt after 1666, becoming an important bookshop and literary salon run by Thomas Longman in the early 18th century. Still today, the Longman Publishing Group sports the sign of the Ship on its commercial logo. We can surmise that all the existing copies of this Martini English edition were sold at that location in the heart of London in the middle of the 17th century, and somehow were dispersed around the world by readers in the last 4 centuries. Tracking the story of the circulation of the Hong Kong copy would possibly reveal some interesting historical path and network of readers and collectors. In conclusion, these two books are reflections of the connection between China and the West, but also testimonies of a time of great turmoil between dynasties in 17th century China and of the contemporary circulation of knowledge in both directions, from Europe to China and vice versa. Studying these books as material remains of networks of knowledge with European and Chinese actors involved is a way for us to keep the stories, images, and lessons on their pages, and those who wrote and touched them alive and well. Thank you for your attention, and here you find a select bibliography of the sources I used for this presentation. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Martin and all speakers. And now we are going to have a Q&A session for the second panel. May Mr. Ross Moncrief, may also Dr. William Pu, please join the discussion via Zoom. And I regret to inform you that Professor Eugenio Manigan is unable to join the discussion due to the time difference. Now I would like to invite Mr. Professor Martin to facilitate this discussion. Mr. Professor Martin, please.
Thank you very much. So yes, we have a few minutes for questions now. So if you have any questions you would like to ask our speakers, then you can raise your hand, and do we have a microphone to pass around the room? Or yes, excellent, great. Perhaps while people think about their first questions that they would like to ask, I have one of my own, if you don't mind me abusing my privileges as the moderator here. Thank you both for your papers. I found them fascinating. I actually have a question for Ross Moncrief to begin. So it's very interesting how you were talking about the divide between the perceived divide between the Manchu rulers and the Chinese subjects. Do you think, or would it be fair of me to say that was there some influence of the ideology of nationalism in Europe at the time, and how much did spreading ideas of nationalism affect this perception?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Great question. The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, I think mentioned how both Staunton and Macartney make reference to the French Revolution and compare the situation in revolutionary France to a potential Chinese revolution against the Manchus. And of course, French Revolution is often regarded as one of the key landmarks in the birth of European nationalism. And I think there's definitely a sense in which ideas of national identity are really playing into a greater sense of the Manchu Chinese conflict than had been the case at the beginning of just after the Qing conquest in the 17th century, when those nationalist ideas weren't so prevalent. I think another really interesting example of this from earlier in the 18th century, which I didn't mention in the presentation, is a very interesting British play, The Orphan of China, based upon the Voltaire's version, The Orphan of China, which in itself is based upon a translation of The Orphan of Zhao, a Yuan dynasty play, into Hald. And the British version of this play is very interesting because versus Voltaire's version, which ends with the Tartars and the Chinese, or Genghis Khan basically becoming a properly Chinese emperor and becoming Chinese and laying down his Tartar roots. The English version of this play, which was written during the 7 Years' War, instead ends with a Chinese revolution against the Manchus and overthrowing them. And I think, there's been some scholarship done on basically how, in some ways, this reflects a British sense of liberty against a sort of universal French tyranny during the 7 Years' War. So I think there's definitely, there's a significant influence of nationalism and national identity on these developing understandings of tensions. Yeah.
Right, thank you very much. Are there any other questions for our panelists? Yes, sir, at the back there.
Okay, so another a question for Dr. Moncrief. Thank you very much for the interesting paper. I just wonder, the idea of a divide between the Manchu as alien and the general Chinese population seems to have been taken up Sun Yat-sen, and I'm thinking of a visit years ago in Taiwan to the mausoleum or debriches of Chiang Kai-shek, where there's a reference to his family having stayed aloof from the alien court. How far do you think that reflected a persistent theme within China? Or was it a question of Western perceptions of the divide feeding back into Chinese revolutionary thought in the late 19th century? Was there a kind of feedback into China itself?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm afraid not one that I am particularly well qualified to answer. I'm, not as an expert at all on later Chinese history, but I think on the question of how Europeans themselves are coming to this understanding of these tensions, I think can maybe go some way to answering that. And I think to some degree, of course, as I've already mentioned, this is about internal changes within Europe. It's about the growth of nationalism, but I think also it is also about empirical experience in China. It is interesting that you get an increasing amount of this discussion of Manchu Chinese tensions following the McCartney embassy and following increased British presence in China. And I do wonder if, I suspect that probably did then have quite a significant impact on the Chinese themselves. I guess, there's obviously, you mentioned Sun Yat-sen. He is coming and staying in London, of course. And I imagine it's very possible that that he is to some extent absorbing not only European ideas of nationalism, but potentially even European ideas about, Chinese nationalism and the situation in China. But I'm afraid, as I say, I haven't really looked into the sort of later aftermath of this, and I think that would actually be something very interesting to do. Would be to look at how this story continues. I think one thing I didn't touch on again is the Taiping Rebellion, and how British people might have construed that, and whether there's any role in of sort of European understandings of Manchu Chinese tensions within the Taiping ideology. So I think it's an open question, really. I'm afraid I don't have a specific answer, but yes, I agree. Potentially some quite interesting connections there.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Professor McManus, in the front row.
So I have a quick question for Dr. Poole. I was fascinated by your account of the reception of moxibustion when we saw, which is not something I enjoy myself, although my wife quite likes it. When we talk about the reception of Chinese medicine, we don't normally talk about moxibustion so much. We normally talk about pulse diagnosis and acupuncture. So I'm wondering if you were to sort of, measure the influence of these three. Is the sort of moment you described a one-off moment, or is this a sort of continuing interest that continues alongside the better known interest in acupuncture and in pulse diagnosis?
Thanks, Stuart. It's a very interesting question. I think off the top of my head, what I would say is that the moxibustion thing was a little bit of a fad. An awful lot of this is really controlled by who happens to have written a book on it, usually Dutch, that can be grabbed and translated into English. I think that at this point, particularly that you'll know the figure Andreas Kleyer, C-L-E-Y-E-R, this is the work that is channeling a lot of this. And there is some material on Japanese medicine as well. I think that the moxibustion thing works briefly because a bookseller has got hold of a supply of the stuff, presumably through, I think, the VOC. and it becomes a little bit of a fad. But the Royal Society don't discuss it again after that. And as far as I'm aware, the interest dies out. Whereas conversely, with acupuncture and pulse medicine, it stays very much alive. There's a lot more material on it, and there are some big and wild claims. It's helped to be kept alive in particular by the fact that perhaps the most extreme Sinophile text of this period is a long essay on the arts of this on the arts and sciences of the Chinese, written in Latin by Isaac Vossius and published in 1685. In which he makes all sorts of extraordinary claims for pulse medicine. And this keeps the discussion alive in learned culture, particularly Latin medicine into the 18th century. So I think the quick answer is acupuncture and pulse medicine has a longer life in Western discussions than moxibustion.
The spontaneous combustion of moxibustion. There we go.
Yes. But as I say, an awful lot of this is really driven by the availability of intermediary texts, usually in Dutch in this period. And in a certain sense, they can only buy what's on offer. And the English, a problem that I referred to throughout the paper, are really dealing with the vagaries of what's happening in other languages. There's almost no direct contact.
Thank you very much. I understand we have run a little bit over time here, but perhaps we have a minute or two if you'll indulge us for one more question. One or two. Yes, gentleman in the middle of the room.
I have a question about the for the professor. And my question is about the dialect. So maybe in China, China is a very large area. So for the different people, they speak the different dialects. Even for the province A, and they don't understand another the dialect from the province B. And so my question is about at that time how they deal with such a problem when they find some of the dialects, maybe the Chinese character has had different meaning, or they maybe have the confusion. How did they deal with such a problem?
Yes, that's a very good question. And there are a number of answers to it. First is that people on the ground are well aware, Western traders are well aware of the problem of dialect. And this can be most spectacularly demonstrated by the use of merchant vocabularies. The man I mentioned, Thomas Hyde, although he's sitting in Oxford in a library, he's very keen on talking to merchants in London, and he actually buys a number of little manuscript pocketbooks. They're about this long, which are basically tables of phonetic things to say in southeastern Chinese ports to get what you want. And it's clearly the phenomenon there that they're dealing with the dialect of the region, and merchant vocabularies had to be generated so that they could shout at one another about what they wanted. And these are very interesting testimonies of the use of presumably extremely crudely pronounced dialect by traders. On the learned end, the West in many ways is driven by a fantasy, and that fantasy from the early 17th century on is that there is a Mandarin class who speak a universal language of the same pronunciation and the same character system, and that works at the learned class throughout China, and that this character system is what the West called a real character, by which they meant it was comprised solely of ideographs and had no phonetic component. The reason why the West was very keen on this is that it offered them the fantasy of constructing a language that bypassed phonology entirely, that bypassed sound, in which the script itself said something about the philosophical nature of the thinking. The same fantasy obtained for Egyptian hieroglyphs, for instance, in the period. This was a very strong driver for Western interests in constructing artificial languages. And that fantasy really persists right the way through to Hook's essay, in which Hook notices that the complexity of the script, the number of strokes that you can find in a character, seems so dramatically at odds with a language which is pronounced entirely as monosyllables, that the script must represent an ancient form of constructed ideographic language, and the modern pronunciation must be an entirely arbitrary overlay on top of it. It really took, even when you're reading Jesuit sources, the Jesuits are extremely slow to say that the script comprises of an ideographic and a phonetic component as well. So it's a very interesting problem in how the West understands the languages. But the West is very reluctant to let go of the idea that Chinese script might actually be a kind of supra-dialectal phenomenon. It really right into the 18th century, this persists in the West. So at the practical level, yes, there is knowledge of dialect because it has to be overcome for trading purposes. And at the theoretical level, there's a knowledge of dialect, but there is also a kind of fantasy that the script somehow transcends this problem. And it would be an awful long time before any Western philologists could admit that this was wrong. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you for your fantastic questions.
Thank you once again, our speakers, and thank you, Professor Morton. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the symposium has almost come to an end. May I now invite Professor Stuart Michael McManus to give us a closing remark. Professor McManus, please.
I won't take too much more of your time, but I just want to invite you all to thank all our speakers once again. We had an amazing array of presentations that, as I said, included plenty of Cannon and marauding Manchus, but also fascinating discussions of visual culture, philology, and science as well. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking our speakers. And of course, thank you to you as well for coming to listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McManus. Please be seated. The symposium has now come to an end. Thank you all for joining us today and hope you all enjoyed it. Have a nice day. Thank you.